Okay, so we've made some great materials. This chapter explores how to apply those great materials. It's a lot more complicated than it seems. To start this file, we're going to open up the uvwmap.max file found in the Chapter 7 folder of your exercise files. And again, we have a few basic objects here with the same material applied. I'm going to hit the letter M to see our material editor. And basically, this is a simple map with all of the default settings, with the exception that a bitmap has been applied to the diffuse color channel. So as I hit the bitmap button here, under the bitmap parameters, I'll be able to see the bitmap that has been applied. It is a picture of the St. Louis Cathedral in downtown New Orleans, one of my favorite places in the world. So I'm going to hit cancel. And that's all we need to know about our material editor. Now the material editor is for making materials. But when we want to fiddle with the adjustment of how that material sits on our object, the material editor isn't usually that much help. So I'm going to close this here. Now as I arc rotate around in the perspective view, I see that I have a pretty good application here to my cylinder, except that the top is very ugly, getting pulled every which way. The sphere is stretched a little bit too much, and the box is just, well, that's just hideous. I also have a teapot, which we'll be getting to later, and that's just all over the place. So let's talk about how to fix this. So if we have a map and we want to change how it's sitting on our image, it's a somewhat simple adjustment. So I'm going to go to the modifier list and add a UVW map modifier. Now, you may have seen as you've been exploring the material editor and in other places throughout 3ds Max, these three letters, UVW. And I know just the name UVW mapping can seem a little technical and scary, but here's what it means. Objects and our scene, as we've talked about, have their own X, Y, Z coordinate space. Now, materials, to be applied properly, also need their own X, Y, Z space. However, the letters X, Y, and Z were already taken to define an object's placement. So, the three letters before X, Y, Z in the alphabet are UVW. So think of UVW like a coordinate system for materials. So again, what XYZ is to objects, UVW is to materials. So let's figure out how to get this material looking good on our object here. We have several different types of mapping here in the UVW mapping options. Planar is just a flat surface, and we could choose cylindrical, spherical, and a few others. But since this is a box, let's go ahead and select box. This applies the image to every face on our object. So as we arc rotate around using the Alt and middle mouse buttons, we'll see that there is a St. Louis Cathedral here, as well as on every single polygon. But this doesn't look quite right. So we could open up the UVW mapping sub-object level and get to Gizmo. The UVW mapping modifier has its own gizmo. And as we move the gizmo, we will change the way the map sits on the object. Again, better demonstrated than explained. So, as I move around, again, making sure that I'm in the sub-object mode, as I move this gizmo around, you'll see that I'm actually moving tiles of the map. I'm going to right-click to cancel out of that. As I hit the R key to get scale, I can scale this down the Z-axis and just kind of adjust it until it looks right, until it sits right on the image. So in order to make this image look correctly along this box, because the orientation of the image and my object are so different, I'll have to tile it several times. But that's okay. Better than have it stretched out like that. That doesn't look very good. I could also hit the letter E for the rotate gizmo and rotate this around. That's kind of quirky. Right-click to cancel out of that. Very good. Now let's right-click and hit the top level and select the sphere. Going to hit the letter Z so we could zoom extents for the sphere. And again, as I arc rotate around, we'll see that this is kind of close but no cigar. This is stretched a little bit too much. So let's add a UVW modifier to this. UVW map. There we go. We can select planar, spherical, or one called shrink wrap. I think planar might be our best bet for this object. Now, we obviously need to go into our gizmo and adjust this because it's tilted facing up. And that's not what way we're looking at it. So I could rotate the gizmo, or I can just change the alignment here. So let me hit Y, and there we go. Already this is looking much better. What we probably want to do is scale this out a little bit more. So I'm going to hit the R key for the scale tool. And in the top view, along the x-axis, I'm going to just spread this out a little bit. And that looks much better. Now, as I turn off this modifier, you'll see the before and after. And what a difference it makes. Okay, let's go to the top level and select the cylinder. It's kind of been getting in our way anyways. Okay, so here we are with the cylinder. Let's go ahead and apply UVW map as well to the cylinder. And let's select, obviously, cylindrical. Now, with cylindrical mapping selected, we're getting the same problem. It's doing a pretty good job of wrapping our map around the main area of the cylinder, but for the top and bottoms, it's still getting this ugly stretch thing. Well, for the cylindrical mapping option, we get an extra option called cap. Select cap, and you'll see that the St. Louis Cathedral material applies to the top and the bottom of the cylinder as well. Finally, let's get to the teapot. The teapot's going to be the quirkiest one here because of its irregular shape. Let's apply a UVW map to this. And already it's looking better. So let's say we wanted to pretend that the St. Louis Cathedral was painted on the side of this teapot. I think planar mapping would probably be the best way. Let's go down and change the alignment. Perfect. And so again, as I select the gizmo, the sub-object level of the UVW mapping modifier, you can see that we could very easily customize and change this map. And just playing with this and seeing how this works is going to be a great preparation for when we talk about the unwrap UVW modifier. That is a significantly more complicated piece of machinery than is simple UVW mapping. But it's based on the same concept that our material is like a piece of paper wrapped around our object. And we haven't had this kind of control yet so far. So it's kind of fun to play with. Again, you could scale it and see what difference that makes. Rotate it. See what difference that makes. Now make sure before moving on, especially before moving on to the unwrap UVW modifier, be sure that you understand these concepts. Watch this video again if you need to, but if this stuff doesn't make sense, then the unwrap UVW modifier certainly won't make sense. So before we get to that though, let's take a little pit stop at multi-sub-object materials, which will allow us to apply materials to different pieces of our object. Again, all of this stuff, the UVW mapping, the multi-sub-object, all of it is preparing us for that great final day when we talk about the unwrap UVW modifier. We're going to start this lesson with the house.max file found in the Chapter 7 folder of your exercise files. Now, as you can tell by the name of this house, this is actually just a box that I box modeled. As I move it around here, you can see that there's a door and a chimney and a window and a roof and all sorts of stuff. Again, just a box done using box modeling. But even though this is one mesh, I want to apply different materials to different pieces of my mesh. We do that by using a multi-sub-object material. But in order to use that material effectively, I have to first create material IDs for the different parts of my object. So let's go ahead and select pieces of this house, and this will also be a great exercise in selecting pieces of mesh. So I like to work at the polygon level, so I'm going to select the polygon button here. And we have this face selected. But I actually want to select all the walls because we're going to apply one material to all the walls. So we're going to give all of that group the same material ID. So I'm going to control-click here, control-click here, control-click here, control-click here. Now I control-clicked and something happened. It didn't exactly work. If I spin it around, I can see that I actually deselected the other side of the house. That's because I don't have ignore backfacing turned on. For this example, at least, it's going to be a good idea to leave that checked. Now as I control-click, I don't get unexpected results. It's easier for me to select the rest of the house. 5 polygons selected, that's exactly what I want. The front and back walls, the left and right walls, and the bottom. So as I scroll down here in my Edit Poly Stack, towards the bottom, I will get this area, the Polygon Properties Rollout. And here for material, I can set ID. Well, I want this to be ID number 1. It already says 1, but just to double check to make sure, I'm going to hit 1 and then hit enter. Now, while I have all the walls selected, I'm going to make a new selection group. I do that by going to this drop down, and I'm going to hit house, and I'm going to type house walls. Hit enter. Now, anytime I want, I can go to this drop down and click this to select all the house walls. Next, I want to select all the roof polygons. So I'm going to click here to deselect. Click here to select those roof polygons. Control click. Make sure you get to the ones under too. That's a big thing. And if by some chance you accidentally select a polygon that you don't want to select, like the front of the house, you can hold the Alt key and click it to deselect. Now it looks like we have all the roof polygons selected, which is good because we want them all to have the same roof material applied. So let's set this ID to 2. Later on, in case you haven't figured that out, we're going to apply different materials to each material ID. So I'm going to hit enter. And let's make a selection set of roof. And hit enter. And again, anytime I want, I can select house walls. And now I can just jump back to roof. You could also do the same thing here under the polygon properties rollout. I could go and using the spinner, select 1 and hit select ID. And do the same thing there. I usually don't like to play with this though, because once I'm done setting my IDs, I don't want to take a chance of blowing anything. So now let's select just the chimney polygons. And it looks like somehow they're already selected. So I'm going to Alt click everything else. That looks pretty good. And making sure I have all the chimney polygons selected, I'm going to set ID to 3 and hit enter. And let's call this chimney and make a selection set out of it. Make sure we have all the right polygons selected here. I'm going to hit 1, select ID, 2, select ID, 3, select ID. All right, looking good. All right, just a few more here, folks. We're just going to select the door and the window and make selection sets out of each one of those as well. So let's go through. And there's actually 5 polygons here. Very good. Let's set the ID to 4 and hit enter. Make a selection set of the door. And finally the window. Good old buddy, Mr. Window. So patient. And let's set the ID to 5. It already is 5, but let's just go ahead and type 5 and hit enter to make sure. Selection set window. And now we're ready to apply our sub-object materials. Let's hit M, and you'll notice that I've already created materials here. We already have house, roof, chimney, door, and window. And so in this material slot, I'm actually going to change from a standard material to a multi-sub-object material. I'm going to just discard old material, and there we go. Now what we're going to do is apply this multi-sub-object material to our house by hitting this Assign Material to Selection button. Now, as you can see here, we have IDs, and these IDs correspond with these IDs. So what we're going to do is just drag and drop these materials into the slot that they need to be in. So remember that the first material ID that we set up was for the walls of the house. So I'm going to drag and drop that material over into this slot. And I'm going to make an instance of this. So that way, if we need to change this, I can do it here as well. Next, I'm going to drag roof to number 2. And you can see this is coming along nicely in those viewports there. Drag the chimney to number 3. Drag the door to number 4. Drag the window to number 5. Hit OK. And now we have a house that looks like all separate objects, but this is just really a box. Hit F9 to render. Oh, isn't that cute? Beautiful. And so you've made your first multi-sub-object materialed object. This comes in so handy, especially for video game modeling, as you make a character. Because of the low polygon nature of video game characters, you probably can't have separate objects that are knee pads or chest plates or whatever video game characters have. You're going to have to extrude the mesh that's already there. Multi-sub-object materials can aid then in mapping as you break these apart to separate material IDs. Now, the unwrap UVW modifier is the subject of this segment, and boy, it is powerful. And when 3ds Max says that something's powerful, that means it is very, very complicated. So with this one, I'm not even going to try to explain it before I demonstrate. So making sure that we have a fresh scene, let's go ahead over to our Create tab, select Extended Primitives, select Chamfer Box, and let's make a cube. Let's go ahead and click and drag that cube. Let go, chamfer the edges. And I got some numbers for you to plug in here. I'm actually going to make this 93, hit the down arrow, 93, down arrow, 93. Make the fillet 3. And let's take those fillet segments up to about 5. What we're going to do here is we're going to pretend that we have an animation to make of rolling dice. Pretty common in the CG world. So we're going to focus on this one die right now. So then we ask ourselves the question, what is the best way to map those little dots to the edges of our die? And obviously the best answer is the unwrap UVW modifier. Let's go ahead and apply material to this right now. I'm going to hit M to get the material editor, assign this material to our die. Let's go to the diffuse channel here, click this button to load up a map, select bitmap, go to the chapter 7 folder of your exercise files, and select this Photoshop file, unwrapped die. I left it a full PSD file, so in case you wanted to see how I made the die, you can go ahead and open that up and take apart the layers and whatnot. I didn't take the time to really organize this properly. I didn't name the layers correctly or anything, but still I thought it might be more enjoyable for you to be able to open that up if you wanted to. And also it's good to know that Max can accept full PSD files. Now let's hit the view button and look at this. Nothing magical, right? And that's actually a secret cool thing about materials, is that a lot of times they can come over like this from Photoshop, looking very flat and cheesy, but when you apply them to objects, they look really sexy in Max. The reason is because the lighting and the texturing that makes them look really good happens in Max, not in Photoshop. So we can make flat art, but when we bring it over into Max, using lights and shadows, we can make them look much more believable. Now, as we look at this map for our die here, we see all the sides of our die represented, but it looks almost as though you took our die and unwrapped the pieces. And folks, that's exactly what the unwrap UVW modifier does. It breaks apart the pieces of your mesh and allows you to put those pieces wherever you want. And wherever you put them on this map is where they will be mapped to. Now, once we get into this level of mapping, it truly is, as I've heard one author say, an art form. This is not something you're going to master in a few minutes by watching this segment. This is another very powerful part of Max that probably could use its own training series. So this is just going to be a very basic overview and introduction into this amazingly powerful tool. So let's close this view window and hit open to open it. And what's really cool about Photoshop documents, PSD files, we get these options asking us if we want collapsed layers, meaning all of them squished into one image, or if we want to pick an individual layer. I'm going to leave these settings as is. I want the collapsed layers here, so I'm going to hit OK. And for this, I'm going to want to show the map in the viewport. I want to see what I'm doing here. And now we're done with the material editor. Now, just by way of comparison, let's go to the Modify tab and add a UVW map modifier. Now let's select Box. See what it does? It doesn't have the power to wrap this around with all the control that we need. So I'm going to delete this and select the tool for the job, Unwrap UVW. Let's go ahead and open up the sub-object level, select Face, and I'm going to hit Control-A to select all of them. If you're using an older version of Max and you can't see the map because of the shaded faces, then just hit the F2 key. For right now, though, I'm going to leave those selected here. I can see my map, and I can see what is selected. I got the best of both worlds here. Let's hit the Edit button down in the Unwrap UVW rollout. Oops, that got maximized for some reason. And here's what we have. The somewhat scary UVW dialog box. And basically what we have here is every single polygon has been broken apart into sides and smashed on top of each other. Well, that doesn't really work very well. So let's use some of these mapping options to break apart these pieces. I'm going to select Mapping, Flatten Mapping. Let's just apply the default settings and hit OK. As you can see, it kind of breaks up our mesh into individual pieces. We have each side as well as chamfered little pieces hanging around here. Now there's some pros and cons to this. The good thing about this is that this will result in the most accurate, clean map. As we put these little chamfered pieces exactly where they should be, there will be the least amount of distortion and stretching in those chamfered pieces. The bad side, however, is that, well, we got to map those little pieces. That's not going to be fun. Who wants to do that? So what we can do is go back to Mapping, Flatten Mapping, and bump this up. And that's going to increase the size of our pieces and therefore make less pieces to have to worry about mapping. So it'll be less work, but it won't map quite as good. So there's a trade-off there. If I hit OK, you'll see what I'm talking about. That was probably a little bit too much. We want more than 2 pieces. But there's another tool we're going to use. Under Mapping, Normal Mapping, we're going to change this to Box Mapping. That's going to get us where we want to go. So I'm going to hit OK. And there we go. 6 individual pieces. All the chamfered edges are attached. Great for demonstrating this in a training series. Now as I click outside to deselect here, and I click back to select, and I try to move these around, you'll see that I'm getting some tearing here. I'm not selecting the chamfered edges. I don't like that. So I'm going to right-click to cancel. And I'm going to go down here and select this Select Element checkbox. Now if I click that chamfered edge, I will select the entire piece. Now by default, we're looking at this background here, this checker pattern. And the reason why that is so that we can match up a checker pattern here with our object in the viewport. This is a very common workflow in 3D to do mapping, is that you first map a checkerboard, and then once you get the checkerboard right, then you map your image. And the reason why a checkerboard is used is because there's a bunch of tiny little squares, and it's easy to see where there's stretching or pulling. And so if it stretches or pulls in an unnatural way with a checkerboard, it's certainly going to do it with your image as well. But we don't need to do that now. If we go to this drop-down, our map that we've applied to our object will already be here. Now, from my experience, when I apply the material after I apply Unwrap UVW, it doesn't show up in this drop-down. So if you want to have your map as a background image like this, make sure that you apply the material before applying the modifier. Now, what's really cool about this dialog box, whatever you select in the viewport will automatically be selected in the Edit UVW's dialog box. So this side right here corresponds to this little piece. And if you're confused at all, this should help clear things up as we really start getting to work here. I'm going to get rid of all these other pieces for now. Just going to click and move them out of my way. You don't have to do this, but I prefer to get everything out of my way when I'm working here. And by default, I have this free transform tool, this one here. It's called freeform mode. And basically what that is that if I'm clicking on a selected object on the inside, as you can see by my icon, I'll have the move tool. As I go to a corner point, I'll get the scale icon. And as I go to an edge point, I'll get the rotate icon. So I can essentially perform all 3 transforms right here with this one tool. It's very nice. So now I have the polygons here that represent the polygons we're going to see on this side of the face. And as you can see, the only thing that's here is this little black line. Well, that's because this little square is over this black line from the edge of the 3 on our die map. So as I move this over, you'll start to see that whatever is in this box shows up on this face. So let's say we want this to be the number 1. So I can move this into position, scale it down, so all the edges fit in there so I don't get any of that black. And look at that. It shows up here in our viewport as a 1. Let's click here. And you'll see now that we have this one selected. So we map this one to the 4. So let's scale this. Beautiful. Now, I'm not going to take the time to get this perfect in this training, but you have the tools now to go ahead and work on your own and finish this project. I'm going to close this window. And actually, before I render, I'm going to go to the Material Editor. And let's go back to the parent level. Let's just take up the specularity quite a bit. Take up the glossiness so we have more of a dye-looking object. Maybe even a little bit more. Close this, hit F9 to render, and see what we got. Beautiful. Quite a nice looking little die for a very little amount of work. All thanks to the power of the Unwrap UVW modifier. Folks, I don't have anything open here, not even Max. I just got to talk to you about something real quick before we go on. Before we start animating in 3ds Max, I want to talk very briefly about the basic principles of animation. This entire chapter is dedicated to this one purpose. No matter how great you make a scene look, how great your characters are, how great your lighting or materials are, if you're creating an animation and it doesn't demonstrate these principles, you will not be as successful as you could be, or maybe not at all. These basic principles or concepts of animation were actually developed or crystallized by Walt Disney and his team of animators so many decades ago. As animation was starting to become a very popular medium, Disney and his team of animators decided to quantify, to crystallize what the basic principles were, what the guidelines should be for great animation. Those guidelines were so phenomenal that they are still the standard today. One of my favorite 3ds Max instructors of all time, Steve Nelly, works at Victor Valley College, and he has a lot of friends that are in charge of hiring for big 3D animation companies. And Steve was telling me that all of his buddies are saying that they get these demo reels from these hotshots right out of school, and all they're looking for are the basic principles of animation, and they're not seeing them. Yes, your characters may look great. Yes, your materials may look great. They may be applied well, and you may know what every button does. But if your animation is not demonstrating these basic principles, your animation won't sing. It'll be lifeless and dull. It'll look artificial and digital. Now, these next few segments are going to be very brief. I'm just going to touch on a few of the principles of animation, the ones that I find most useful. There are a lot more, obviously, but I want to get you thinking about being a really good CG animator. Now, we're talking about 3ds Max in this training series, but it's quite possible that once you get established in a job, you may be working with a different software package. But these principles will always hold true, from Maya to Max to XSI and everything in between. The next few movies could really enhance your career, especially if animating objects is something that you plan on doing. Starting again here on the desktop, let's go to our exercise files, Chapter 8, and open up the first of these principles, squash and stretch. Now, the concept of squash and stretch basically says that when a soft object comes in contact with another object, it will deform. And how much the object deforms will be primarily determined by its velocity upon impact. But as an object that is soft collides with a hard object, it will squash, but it will also stretch. And that's a big part of this. Let's just see how this looks. We haven't been dealing with animation so far, but in all of the examples we're going to be opening up in this chapter, we will have animation. To preview that animation, hit the question mark key or the / key, whatever you want to call it. Same button. So as we look at this here, we see this bouncing ball, and I'm going to hit that question mark again. We'll see that it squashes, but it also stretches out a little bit. So the concept of squash and stretch is that an object deforms, but that it keeps its volume. This is very important. Now we're going to get a lot into animation in the next chapter, but just while we're here, let me give you a few basic pointers on animation while we're previewing these animations. Notice that as I play back my animation, it's only actually playing back in the currently selected viewport. Once I stop playing my animation, then all viewports sync up to the current frame. You might also have noticed this little time slider here, which we'll talk about more in the next chapter. But I could also click and just scrub this instead of playing it if I want to. I could hit these little arrows to move forward in time, one frame at a time, or back as well. Or I could use the comma and period keys to move backwards in time or forwards in time, respectively. So again, the comma key moves it to the left, the period key moves it to the right, again, one frame at a time. And also, again, the question mark stops and starts our animation as well. Okay, so that's it for squash and stretch. Let's go on to talk about exaggeration. Let's go to File, Open, navigate to our exercise files, Chapter 8, O2 Exaggeration. Now this happy little guy is what we call a biped. We create bipeds in a part of 3ds Max called Character Studio. There's an entire chapter devoted just to Character Studio coming up a little later. So let's talk about the concept of exaggeration. Basically, we exaggerate things when we're animating to draw attention to the action that has been performed. So let's hit the question mark key and see what this little guy's doing. He's picking up a weight. He falls over backwards. Somehow magically picks himself up. I'm going to stop it here, and I'm going to hit the comma key to back up a little bit. He's grabbing this imaginary weight down here on the ground, but look at the way his arms swing into position as I hit the period key to nudge one frame at a time. Look at how widely he's swinging his arm around. There may be a little bit of machismo, a little bravado in that arm swing. He's pretty cocky. Now, he didn't need to swing his arm all the way around like that. All you need to do is reach out and grab right in front of him. But that big swing adds a lot to this animation. And so again, in summary, the principle of exaggeration is that sometimes when we animate, we make things a little bit more flamboyant than we would in real life. This draws viewers in to what's going on, and also, as you can see here, gives a little sense of character as well. Next on the hit list is anticipation. Let's go to File, Open, Same Drill, Desktop, Exercise Files, Chapter 8, O3 Anticipation. Click it, open it. In this adventure of our biped, our little dude is going to do a backflip. Let's just watch how that works. There he goes. Flips backwards. Very nice. Now, I'm going to hit the Home key to jump to the very first frame. Likewise, you could hit the End key to jump to the very last frame of your animation. So again, I'm going to hit the Home key to get back to frame 1. And now, as I play this slowly, I'm just going to drag the time slider here. Now, this is where the main action actually starts to take place. This is a backflip that we're viewing, and he actually starts the backflip right about now. But as you can see here, we have about 32 frames, which in a 100-frame animation, roughly, is about a third of the entire animation is just prep here. Just this guy getting ready. And look at how those arms are raised high in the air. And then they swing back to prepare for the backflip. That's anticipation. The action just doesn't happen. There's a warm-up action that prepares the viewer, builds a little excitement, if you will, for what is about to happen. Again, look how wildly those arms go up, and then cock back, and then flip our little guy into his backflip. And truth be told, I think anticipation is one of the great secrets of animation. If you watch Disneyland commercials, for example, you might see Tinkerbell fly around the screen and kind of hover there a little bit while the announcer's announcing something or whatever. And then as she goes to sprinkle her pixie dust across the Disney logo, for example, she kind of cocks back a little bit and then flies. This is the concept that probably gets me going the most. Every time I have an animation, before I send it for final output, I will review it and I will look and I will ask myself, where am I using anticipation? Where could I use anticipation more to give some more life to my animation here? These are all great principles, but the one that gets me out of bed in the morning is anticipation. In the Chapter 8 folder of our exercise files, I've opened up O4 Follow Through. And in the next adventure of our biped, we join him as he's gingerly tossing a grenade here. And it blows up and he kind of covers his ears and whatnot. I'm going to hit the Home key. The principle I want to communicate to you here is the concept of follow through. As I scrub the timeline, he gets his grenade out, pulls the pin, tosses it, and that's about where he probably lets it go. But you'll notice as I scrub the timeline further that his arm keeps going around. And as I go back and forth here, you'll see that both arms are involved in the process. His vertebrae, his pelvis, both legs, they're involved in following through. So the concept of follow through says that if there's an action like a swing of a golf club or a punch or the lobbing of a grenade, then once that action happens, there is follow through. There is an aftermath that needs to be considered. And if you think about it, with this animation, the personality, the character of it, didn't really happen so much in the action, but in the aftermath, in the follow-through. His leg kind of tilts up here on that one side, the right leg. It kind of takes him a minute to get his bearings back. So again, in this instance, and with other instances where follow-through is used appropriately, it wasn't the action, but the aftermath of the action that really sells it. And finally, we come to weight, a subject that my wife reminds me of on a daily basis. And for this example, I'm going to use the o5weight.max file in the Chapter 8 folder of the exercise files. And folks, I've really saved the best for last here. If newbies and amateur animators blow it on any one thing, it is this concept, the concept of weight. Weight's a toughie, though. And it's not so much a principle of animation, so much as it's something to be really aware of as you're animating. You see, the software programs that we're using, they don't understand the concept of weight. They just move the objects where we tell them to put them. Max doesn't know if something weighs 10 pounds or 5,000 pounds. We as animators have that power, and we have to utilize that power and communicate to the viewer how much something weighs. How much does a character weigh? How much do objects weigh? When a digital character sets his keys down on the table at the end of a long day, do they drop gingerly like a feather, or do they seem to come down with great force? Or maybe somewhere in between. As an animator, again, the power is in your hands. So let's watch our little biped here in his final adventure in the world of basic principles and see if you could tell how much the object weighs that he is picking up. I'm going to hit the question mark after I select Max. Now, see him stumbling here? Even when he sets it down, there's just a sense of, oh, finally, letting go. Barely stumbling to make it. There's obviously a lot of weight to this object. But again, remember, the computer doesn't see weight. You and I see weight. It seems like amateur demo reels are filled with characters that gingerly float as they're walking. Be aware of this as you're animating characters or car keys or whatever. Ask yourself before you start animating, what does this object weigh, and how can I communicate that to the viewer? Those that employ you and those that view your work will definitely be impressed. So that's the basic principles. See, I told you I'd keep it short and simple for once in my life. And now let's get into how to animate Max for yourself. What buttons do you push to make things come alive? Now, I know that I said this for materials, but this is where Max really gets fun. I mean, really, really, really gets fun. You could animate just about anything in Max. And it's so simple to get started. So let's jump on over there and start talking about it. All right, folks, it's time to start bringing stuff to life. I love animation. It's really the reason why I'm here. I love clicking and dragging and making a sphere, and then in 2 seconds, bringing it to life and giving it a personality. Animation is created when we take a series of still images called frames and play them in a consecutive order. Another thing we need to be aware of when we're talking about animation is the concept of keyframes. Keyframes is a traditional animation term that refers to the key points of an object that's animating. Let's say, for example, you had a bouncing ball. The keyframes, or the really important parts, were typically drawn by the big bucks animators, the ones that got paid all the cash. And so the big bucks animators might draw a keyframe of the ball up, and then a ball hitting the ground, and then the ball up at the top of the arch after it's already bounced. Again, those frames would be called the keyframes. Then the project would be shipped off to the junior animators, or maybe somewhere else internationally where labor is a little bit cheaper. And those lower paid animators would create the frames in between the keyframes. And this process of creating the in-between frames is called tweening. Now, as you can see, these terms were created for traditional hand-drawn animation, but that terminology still carries over and is used today. The good news is that you and I, as operators of 3ds Max, are the big bucks animators. We create the keyframes. We specify where that ball should be when, and then Max calculates automatically the frames in between. Watch how easy it is to animate in 3ds Max. I'm going to select a sphere, make it in the top view, right-click to get out of creation mode. So far, nothing new, right? We just have a basic sphere. Now I'm going to go into auto key mode. I'll discuss auto key mode a little bit more in the next segment. But now all we have to do, once we've turned on auto key mode, is move a time slider in time and transform this object in some way. I am going to move this up. Instantly, we see these little boxes pop up in the timeline, here and here. Guess what, folks? Those little boxes are the keyframes. So as I hit the home key, and then the now familiar question mark key from the last chapter, we've created our first animation. It's just that simple. I'm going to hit the question mark to stop that. So you can see how fun, quick, and easy it is to animate in 3ds Max. So let's talk about more of these principles related to animation so that we can do more than just move a ball up and down. We're going to start off this segment right where we left off in the last one, with basically a sphere animated to go up just a little bit. Let's talk a little bit more about this auto key mode. This is the mode that we're going to be using primarily throughout this training. The other mode is set key mode. In set key mode, to set a keyframe, we have to hit the set key button, and then every time we want to set a keyframe, we have to hit the key button. So just so you know how that works. But again, for this training, we're just going to stick to auto key. And again, the way the auto key works is that it remembers everything that you're doing. It's like a bad girlfriend. Now this becomes critical because when we're in auto key mode, we have this red bar here, which again means that every change we make is going to be remembered by Max. So if we move in the front view, for example, if we move this ball over to the right, you'll see that a new keyframe has been created at frame 35. So at frame 0, we've told Max to remember where this ball is and when it is, and then at frame 35, it has to be here. And then at frame 62, it has to be here. So if we hit the home key, then hit the question mark button to play this animation, you'll see that Max has to tween these. It has to make it happen. So be careful when you're in auto key mode because you could accidentally change something and add a keyframe where you didn't mean to. And likewise, if I turn off auto key, and I can do that by hitting the auto key button, but I usually just prefer the keyboard shortcut N. The letter N as in Nancy on your keyboard will turn off auto key mode. And it's kind of handy because we could still see the keyframes. But watch as I move this over to the left a lot. As I hit the home key to play this animation from the beginning, we'll see that the whole thing is moved over. I'm going to stop that. But again, if auto key would have been on, it just would have added a new keyframe instead of moving the whole thing over. So again, if you want to affect all keyframes, turn off auto key. If you want to create a new keyframe or adjust a keyframe that's already there, then make sure that auto key is on. Now I'm going to hit the letter N to turn off auto key. I'm going to hit home, and I'm going to hit delete to delete that sphere. I'm going to create a teapot in the top view here. One other thing I kind of glanced over in the last segment I want to clarify here. I'm going to hit N to turn on auto key mode. And then I'm going to go out to frame 60, for example. 59, 60, whatever. And this time I'm going to use the scale transform. Now, so far, there's no keyframes yet, right? But watch as I scale this up. Watch frame 0 in the timeline. Ah, see that? A keyframe was automatically created. That's one of the features of auto key. If you turn on auto key and you animate a parameter that doesn't have any keyframes yet, a keyframe will be added to frame 0 for you automatically. This could be good sometimes and not so good other times. Now let's talk about a few of these time tools down here, these time navigation controls. Now so far we've given you keyboard shortcuts for all of these. This goes to the beginning, which is like the home key. This goes to the end, which is like the end key. Now this button here will usually go back a frame, but as you can see once I click it, it actually goes back through each keyframe. That's because I have this button selected, the key mode toggle. When this button is depressed, these two buttons here that usually advance one frame or go back one frame actually go forward one keyframe or back one keyframe. It also changes the functionality of the keyboard shortcuts in the same way. So remember, the period key advances one frame and the comma key goes back a previous frame. Well, when this button is depressed, those keyboard shortcuts also are affected, and the comma key goes back a keyframe, the period key goes to the next keyframe. We could also use this slider here to go back in time or forward in time. So whichever way you prefer. Keep in mind as well that once the keyboard toggle is on, these little arrows no longer advance per frame, but they also jump to the next keyframe. And of course we also have the play button, which again the shortcut for is the question mark or / key. Finally, we need to discuss how to get to the time configurations dialog box, a very handy and useful tool. We could do that in one of two ways. We could hit the time configuration dialog box, or on any of these tools here, we could just right click and it'll instantly pop up. Now over here, under frame rate, we have some stuff that's a little bit more sophisticated. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but I want to introduce you to a couple key concepts here. These initials here, FPS, stand for frames per second. I mentioned that animation is created by a series of still images played in a row. And so the frame rate, or frames per second, is how many of those images show up in a second. For digital video and television, 30 frames per second is the standard. If you are doing something that will be in a film, you'll want to go to 24 frames per second. Now you'll also often see these sets of initials as well, NTSC and PAL. NTSC, to give you an idea what this is for, is short for the National Television Standard Committee. Basically a big group of nerds who, somewhere around the 1950s, decided what TV should be like. They set up the frame rate for television and a few other issues. NTSC is pretty much the video standard for North America. However, if you went to Europe, most European countries support the PAL standard, except for France. PAL stands for phase alternating line, and again is the standard in most of Europe. The frame rate of NTSC is roughly 30 frames per second. The frame rate of PAL is 25 frames per second. Just a little technical detail to be aware of, or to impress people at parties. Really, really boring parties. Finally, here in the time configuration dialog box, we can change our end time. So if we are going at the standard 30 frames per second, 100 frames is less than 3.5 seconds. So if we want to increase the time of our animation, then we could hit this slider here, and you can see my slider shrinking down at the bottom to bump up the amount of frames, or in other words, increase the length of time of our animation. Now that we got the basics out of the way, these next few segments are going to be very brief little tips on how we can be better animators. One of them is by adjusting the pivot point. We haven't talked too much about pivot points yet. Let me show you how this works. I'm going to create a teapot in the top view. And let's go ahead and hit Z to zoom extents. Let's go ahead and hit the letter E to get access to the rotate tool. Now again, we haven't talked about this yet, but look at the center of the transformation. The rotate gizmo is centered around this bottom center point of the teapot. And you might be saying, well, who cares? Well, it's a good question, but look, if we're going to animate this and rotate as if someone were pouring this, well, unless someone had their hand in the middle of the teapot, that would not be very realistic animation. It's going back and forth. It would be much more realistic if we can get the center of transformation to happen here on the handle. That would be much more believable. I'm going to hit Control-Z to undo that. And so the problem here is that we need to adjust the pivot point. That is this center point. To do that, we actually go one over from the Modify tab into the Hierarchy tab. Simply select Effect Pivot Only. I'm going to select the Move tool here. And in the front view, I'm going to move this into position. And it looks like in the top view, this is already in good shape. That's exactly where I want it, centered on the top of the handle. And then turn off Effect Pivot Only to get back to square one. Now as I hit the letter E to get the rotate gizmo, and I rotate, you'll see it has a much more natural movement. It should pour from that angle because that's where someone would hold it from. Not from here. That's ridiculous. Now I realize that you probably won't be doing too many T-porn animations, unfortunately. But this comes in real handy with characters. When you move your elbow, for example, you don't want your elbow to rotate around the center of your forearm. You want it to rotate around your elbow. Pivot points play a huge role in accurate animation. Let's go to File, open, get your exercise files. Chapter 9, cylinder squish. It's just a little animation of a cylinder getting squished. No big whoop, right? Now I want to show you a few tricks on how to adjust keyframes. So let's turn on auto key mode, and notice we don't have any keyframes. As I scroll this timeline, we have no keyframes. Well, the answer lies in our selection. We will always see keyframes for selected objects down here in the time ruler, as they call it. So if I select this, now we see our keyframes. And actually, even if we turn off auto key, we'll still see our keyframes. Now, just as with objects, when a keyframe is selected, it turns white. So by default, these scale keyframes are blue. When we click one of them to select it, it becomes white. Now, all we have to do to move one is click and drag. As we take keyframes like this apart from each other, it slows down the animation because it has to go to the same distance, but it has more time to do it in. Likewise, we can drag it to the left and bring them closer together, which will increase the speed of the animation. But not only can we move keyframes, we could also copy and paste them. Let's say, for example, after this cylinder gets squished, I wanted it to go back to its original size. I wouldn't have to go over here and scale this up manually and then go compare and contrast and see where they are and try to make a match and all that stuff. All I would have to do is select this first keyframe because, again, I want this to be the end keyframe as well. I want the same value to be over here. All I have to do to copy and paste them is the same way, again, that we clone objects. Hold the Shift key while dragging, let go somewhere over here, and that same keyframe has been copied in the same way. Going to hit the Home key, question mark to preview. Beautiful. It's just that easy, folks. As if all the stuff we've been animating already isn't fun enough, there is so much more to cover when we talk about animation. And actually, remember all those times we've been seeing spinners throughout the program? Typically when we see those spinners, it means that that property is animatable. Let's create a cylinder in the top view. Hit the letter Z, zoom extents. Let's go over to the Modify tab, add a bend modifier. Let's hit the letter N as in Nancy for auto key. Let's take this bend angle over. Let's pretend like we're making a slinky here that's going from one direction to another. Hit the N key, and then go with that over the other side. Let's go a negative 180. Could have just as easily typed that in, but oh well. And notice also that once a property has been animated, you'll see these little red brackets around it. Even when auto key is off, it lets you know that this property is being changed over time. So don't just go blindly, haphazardly changing it without really thinking about what you're doing first. Okay, so now we've actually animated this little bendy cylinder. This little piece of macaroni here. I'm going to resize this viewport so I can see this a little better. Let's check out what this looks like. I'm going to hit the Home key, hit the question mark. Oh, look at that. Oh, that's good stuff. And so this is just one property of one modifier. You can imagine with a little bit of time and creativity, you could get dangerous at this. Now, one other thing you might not have been aware of that you can animate is a material. Yes, believe it or not, folks, you could actually animate material properties. I'm going to hit the letter M, and you'll see all these sliders here. We could animate all of these, but what you could also do is animate colors. So I'm going to apply a basic material to this, and I'm going to change the diffuse color to, I don't know, pink. Looks good. Let's go ahead and turn on auto key, hit the N key, and let's again change the diffuse color to a blue, maybe a dark blue here, and close it. Now you'll notice that we get these same red brackets around our colors, letting us know that these animate over time. Also in the sample slot, we're getting this auto key red around here again, indicating that this is live and that we're animating it. And actually, since we're here, I'm going to hit Home one more time and bump up the specular level, and then hit End and bump it all the way down. So we could go backwards or forwards, it doesn't matter. Now, as I move this to where I can see it, hit the Home key and then preview with the question mark. We can see that this little slinky thing animates and changes color at the same time. I'm just going to go ahead and hit the question mark key to stop that here. As you can see, as we move, even this little specular level thing goes up and down as we drag this. Oh, that's so awesome. Now, sometimes when you animate materials, it doesn't show up in the viewports, but it will still show up here in the sample slot. Watch the sample slot as I scrub back and forth. It changes colors as well. If you ever wanted to preview what your material will look like, you could actually go here and click Make Preview. We'll use these default settings, that's fine. Hit OK. Let it go through one time, and it'll automatically open your player and play a movie of your material animating. Good stuff, folks. Now, this is a really short movie, but the implications of the few things that I've talked about here are huge. Try playing with bump maps and animating the amount of bump. Try playing with the twist modifier and the taper modifier. It's just unbelievably cool how much out there is to do. In this segment, we're going to talk about trajectories. Trajectories are a visual indication of the path of an animation. Let's select a teapot and create it in the top view. Hit the letter N to turn on Auto Key. And let's move this around using the Move transform here. Let's move this all about. Over here, and then over here, for example. And, it can get confusing where this thing is going. I'm going to hit Home and then preview it. It's kind of going all over the place. And you could tell if we added a few more keyframes here, this could get even a little bit more confusing. Whoa, it's all over the place. Now, if I jump to the middle, for example, let's say over here, I have no idea where this teapot came from or where it's going. So if we could turn on the trajectory of the animation, we could see all that stuff. We do that by going over to the Motion tab. And let's select right at the top the Trajectories button. There we go. Now we can easily see the path that this is traveling. But not only that, this gives us a visual indication of what's going on here. These white squares are the keyframes. So every time we move in time, and our teapot is stopped on a given frame that has a white box, we can look down at our timeline down here and see that, yes, this frame does have a keyframe. These little white dots in between represent the frames as well. Now it gets even cooler, folks. We can go to the sub-object level of our trajectory and then select keyframes and then visually move them where we want them. This is cool. Oh, this is cool. Not only that, we can move along in our timeline. And let's say, for example, we wanted to add a key right here. Well, once we're in sub-object mode, the Add Key button becomes available. Hit that to add a key. So I'm going to hit the Add Key button. And once I do that, I'll get this kind of tool where I can go in and click to add keys wherever I want. I could then go select the Move tool and move these keys around. How cool is that? Now if I hit the Home key and watch this, it'll follow the trajectory that I made visually, which is really cool. But it gets even better. I'm not going to leave trajectories before I show you this really sweet secret trick. I'm going to go to File, Reset, No, Yes. And I'm going to create a shape, actually. I'm going to create a helix in the top view. And let's go modify that. We want a lot of turns here. Oh yeah, very cool. And we want a lot of height. There we go. I'm going to hit the letter Z for zoom extents. And let's change bias a little bit. Let's lower it slightly. Take radius 2 down. Oh, this is going to be cool. Now let's go back to the Create tab. Back to Geometry and create a basic sphere. Doesn't really matter where. Now I'm going to go back to the Motion tab, select Trajectories, and right now, you were with me when we reset this scene, there's no animation. We haven't done anything to this yet. But what we can do from the Trajectories menu is that we can tell this sphere to automatically animate along the path of this spline that we've just made. And the anchor points of the helix will become the keyframes of the sphere. Oh, this is amazing. I'm going to hit the Convert From button, then hit the helix, and look at that. I'm going to hit Home. Let's try this out. Look at that. A little rough. Now we can go in and tweak this a little bit, but still, all the same, how hard would that be to animate that from scratch? That would be a job that I would not want to do. So we have this super quick way to make this object follow the path of the spline, and we didn't set any keyframes. Yes, it's blocky, but it's way easier to adjust something that's already made than to have to do this all from scratch. Trajectories really are a sweet part of playing around with animation in Max. I want to introduce you here to a couple concepts that are a little bit more sophisticated. To do that, I'm going to use the bouncing-ball.max file found in the Chapter 9 folder of your exercise files. Basically what we have here is two spheres that start at the top, fall down, bounce back up. The one on the left is locked. The one on the right is the one that we're going to be playing with. Now, as I hit the Home key and preview this using the question mark key, we'll see that this is not realistic animation in the slightest. This is just simple, au naturel keyframes made in the standard way without any flair or grace whatsoever. Now, the reason why this does not look believable is because the velocity in between these keyframes is almost constant. Not totally, but almost. If this were a real bouncing ball, it would start falling a little slower, and then it would gain much more momentum, and then once it hit the ground, it would fly up significantly faster and then slow down once it got to the top of the arc. So as an advanced concept in animation, we can change the animation tangents, which will change the velocity coming into and out of a keyframe. So I'm going to select this middle keyframe. This is the one that's going to have the magic here. So I'm going to right-click on it, and because we're in the front view and we're going up, I know that the keyframe I want to adjust is the Z position. Right-clicking on a keyframe is a great way to access all the keys that are applied to that particular frame. We'll talk in a moment about applying different types of keyframes from all three different transforms on the same frame. When we do, we're going to have many attributes to choose from here, not just X, Y, and Z position. It does get a little hairy. So as you want to adjust one particular part of a keyframe, right-clicking on a keyframe and selecting it from this menu is the way to go. So we're going to adjust the Z position part of this keyframe. Now this is a little complex. Basically what we want out of this is the way that the speed comes into and out of this keyframe. So as I select this in drop down here, I'm going to select this option here. Now towards the end of this training series, I'm going to offer a brief overview of many advanced topics in 3ds Max, one of them being animation. When we get into the upper echelons of advanced animation, we don't just use keyframes, we use curves to specify the velocity coming into and out of keyframes. When we use curves and graphs to do this, basically when a line is horizontal, that means there is no action. When a line has more of a vertical alignment, such as at this part of the curve, then changes happen much more quickly. And so if I select this tangent, basically what's going to happen here is that when the animation comes into this keyframe, it's going to start out slow. Remember, horizontal means slow. And then it's going to go vertical, which means it's going to start out slow and then quickly speed up, which is what we want. Now, coming out of that keyframe, we want to select the opposite here. We want it to come quickly out of this keyframe because it's going to have a lot of energy coming off of this bounce. Then it's going to slowly taper off. As you see in this curve, it starts to go horizontal again. This is going to get us what we want. Let's close this, hit the Home key, and hit the question mark to preview. Is it realistic? Absolutely not. But we'll see as I pause it right about here that it starts to fall slower. But again, the keyframes are the same. So it has to meet right here at frame 30 at the same spot as this one. So in order to do that, it has to speed up. which it does. And then coming off of the bounce, again, it's going to be a lot faster. But in order to meet up at the same place at frame 60, it has to slow down considerably, and so it does. So again, is it realistic? Definitely not. Is it more realistic? Yes, absolutely. Hit the question mark key to stop that, and I'm going to hit File, Reset. I don't want to save, and I do want to reset. Let's make a box. I'm just going to hit this Q button, so I have one less step to worry about when I'm making it. I'm going to hit N to turn on Auto Key, and what I'm going to do is go out here to about frame 60 or so, and I'm going to add every single transform as a keyframe. I'm going to move this, and I'm going to rotate it, and I'm going to scale it. Now you'll notice as we do that we're changing the color of our keyframes. Max does such a great job at organization. In the same way that the coordinate space of objects is XYZ and the coordinate space of materials is UVW, these three basic transforms have their own colors that they identify with. When we set a move keyframe, it is red. And I'll move out here a little bit farther in the timeline and move that, and you'll see that we've created a red keyframe. Move a little bit farther out, select the rotate tool, and just like RGB, red, green, blue, the color components of light, if red signifies a move keyframe, then green signifies a rotate keyframe. Finally, if we move a little bit farther out, if we scale this, we'll create, you guessed it, a blue keyframe. When we have multiple keyframes on the same frame, they kind of pile up. And don't forget that this is totally legal. I can have multiple transforms going on at once. I'll preview this. It scales up, rotates, and moves all at once. Max doesn't have a problem with that. So again, just a few advanced concepts here in animation to wet your whistle. But now as we prepare to move along with this solid foundation of animation behind us, let's get to talking about rigging. Okay, folks, I gotta be honest with you. We're going to talk about rigging in this chapter, and rigging tends to be a little dry. As a matter of fact, it's my least favorite thing to do in Max, but it's a necessary evil. We have to cover this. If your mesh doesn't have a good rig, you will not be able to animate very well, especially characters. So, the good news is, though, seeing that this is going to be a little bit dry, I planned ahead, and I saved the big guns for now. So let's go to File, Open, Exercise Files, Chapter 10, Werewolf. Getting excited? Sound cool? Open up Werewolf Bones and hit Open. Oh, awesome. This low poly model of a werewolf is provided to you, the Lynda.com audience, courtesy of David Gibbons. David is my lead animator and my assistant producer at my animation studio, Wedge Case Animation, an extremely talented CG artist and animator. And we're actually going to be animating this guy a little bit later on. But I want to use this as an example of what rigging is. I'm assuming that this mesh, this figure, was created in the standard way with box modeling. Taking out a vertex here and there, extruding a polygon, a little bit of beveling, that type of thing. And so it could be that this just is a box. So then how do we get those hands and those fingers to close and open? If we have to animate all those vertices individually every time we want to move anything on the character, we're not going to be very successful animators at all, because animation of that scale would be impractical, if not impossible. So what we need to do then to our mesh is give it a skeleton. We want to apply a system to control the mesh, a system that behaves like a skeleton would. Then we don't have to move the vertices in the mesh, we just animate the skeleton. The process of applying the skeleton to the mesh is called rigging. Usually there are two forms of rigging in 3ds Max. We do one of two things. We either create a bone system, which we'll cover, or we use Character Studio to create a biped. Remember that guy we used a little bit earlier for the principles of animation? Yeah, him. He's from Character Studio. So we could use that guy as a skeleton or the bone systems. And we're going to be covering both of those a little bit later. But let me just show you how cool this rigging stuff is. Again, assuming that this is just a box, or was, I want to show you all these little doohickeys popping out from this guy. Now these are non-rendering objects that are considered helpers. If we hit F9 to render this, we won't see any of them. Let's close this render here. Now these little gizmos are kind of like controllers for the bone system. So let's, for example, select this ring here. I'm going to select the rotate tool. I'm going to turn off angle snap. And let's rotate this along this red ring here. And look at that. Rotating this arm. And look at how the mesh and even the material deforms right along with it. Oh, that is so cool. I'm going to hit W for the move tool. And as I raise this arm, you can see I raised the arm. And that's so cool. But not only that, watch the hand of this werewolf as I move his arm up and down. You'll see that it pivots. It wouldn't be very realistic motion if his hand stayed the same as we brought it up this high. So it pivots. So part of a bone system is setting limits. They can only go up so high, and that type of thing. We can select this ultra cool controller to open and close the werewolf's mouth. Click on a foot here to move his foot up and down. And all of this stuff can be animated. I can hit the letter N for the auto key, move it out, click it up, and I've animated this. Hit home, and the werewolf raises his leg. It's just that easy to do character animation once you've rigged. That's why rigging is so essential. Yes, it's a tough, laborious, frustrating process sometimes, but hey, if character animation is the end result, count me in. So let's get to talking about this bone structure. Now, I probably worried you a little unnecessarily in the last segment when I complained about how tedious it can be to skin or rig an object. But that's really only when we're working at really advanced levels. And all this basic stuff, rigging is actually pretty fun. So I apologize for whining. I'm going to create a cylinder in the top view. And actually what we're going to do here is we're going to make and animate and rig an arm bowling. So let's go ahead and make the arm here. Actually, I probably want this a little bit higher. And I definitely want more segments here. Once you apply a bone system to your objects, you really want there to be enough mesh so that when the object deforms, it doesn't look too crinkly. We want a nice, smooth deformation as this object moves around under the bones. Okay, our cylinder's made, or our bowling arm. Now let's create the bones. Now we do so still under the Create tab, but bones are actually considered a system. So we've talked about geometry and shapes. We will yet talk about lights and cameras, helpers and space warps. But for now, let's go to Systems. Click on Bones. And to create bones, just click and then let go. Click and let go, click and let go, click and let go. And once you're done, right click. And the cool thing about bones is that they're already kind of linked together in a very natural way. If I select and move one of these bones, you'll see that they're all joined together. Kind of nice. If I rotate this one, it rotates independently. If I rotate the top one, the parent if you will, they all come along for the ride. It's a very natural way to do things. I'm going to hit the letter H, select all my bone objects by shift-clicking the bottom bone here, and then I'm going to delete them. I'm going to do this right now. I just did that by way of demonstration. So let's select bones again, and let's click on the top here. And right about here, click again. Right about here, click again. And at the bottom, click one final time, and then right-click. Now you'll notice that there'll be this little nub left over. That's fine. That's used for a little bit more sophisticated rigging techniques. We're just going to kind of ignore that for right now. So now what we need to do, I'm going to right-click here, get the Move command, select the cylinder, and under the Modify tab, we're going to add a modifier to this cylinder to tell it to be skin. But if it's going to be skin, it's going to want to know, well, how do I know how to deform? So it's going to ask us what bones to use. We do that by hitting this Add button in the bones area. Before I do that, though, I want to go to the top view and make sure that my cylinder is squared away and that my bowling arm is adjusted properly. Okay, looks ready to bowl 300. Let's go ahead and hit the Add button. I'm going to just click and drag a marquee to select all, hit Select, and now they are linked together. And actually what I'm going to do now is right-click on the cylinder, click Object Properties, uncheck Show Frozen in Gray, and then just right-click again to freeze this. The reason why I'd want to do that is because, again, I'm animating the bones here. That's the magic of adding this skeletal system, is that I don't have to fiddle with the mesh at all. I rig it like we just did, and then I animate the bones. So I want to be able to easily select them to animate them, and I don't want to accidentally select the cylinder. And freezing it is just fine. We can still move this, like so, even if the cylinder is frozen. And already you're getting a sense of how cool this could possibly be. Look at that mesh to form. Oh, that is awesome. Right-click to cancel out of that. Let's turn on Auto Key. Let's start out by selecting this top bone. Let's rotate it along this axis in the front view here. And let's select this bone maybe a little bit. This bone a little bit. Try to make the perfect bowler's arm, as if we're looking at a side view of someone bowling. So this is the before, and move along a little bit farther in time, and let's animate it as if they had just released the ball. There's this, and rotate this, and rotate this. Beautiful. Look how easy that is. I'm going to hit home. Let's preview this using the question mark. And look at that. Now we can fiddle with the tangents here and make this look a little bit better, but you get the idea. That's how easy it is to do a basic rig. Again, I apologize for whining. It's now time to talk about child rearing digital style. And that was pretty much the lamest thing I've ever said. So let's just go ahead and go to the File Open menu and pretend that never happened. Go to the desktop, Exercise Files, Chapter 10. Let's open up this file I created called Parent and Kids. And what we're going to do is talk about parenting, a really essential part of animation. You've heard the terms parent and child before as we worked in the material editor. Let's see how it applies to objects. I basically have here just a group of spheres. I thought about calling them Britney, because then I would have Britney spheres. So I'm going to click and drag to select all of these. And I'm going to Alt-click the center one, so it is unselected. In the front view, I'm going to hit the letter W and move them down a little bit. Oh, that looks pretty cool. Now I want to link these together. And when we link objects, we create this parent-child relationship. And the way this works is that children move independently. I move them and nothing happens. However, when the parent moves, the children follow. The way we set up this relationship is by going to this button here in the main toolbar, Select and Link. Click that. And then we select the children first because we're establishing a parent here. So we always click on the children first, click and drag, and once we get to the parent, we'll have this icon, let it go, and it'll flash white for a second, letting you know that that relationship has been created. Now, I'm going to hit the letter W again to get to the Move tool. I can still move these children independently. However, if I move the parent now, the children come along for the ride. I'm just going to right-click to cancel out of that. Even cooler, say for example, in the top view, I can now rotate these, and look at that. Notice that this parent-child relationship has affected this. So I'm rotating the parent, the children as a group have to follow. That's kind of sweet. Now, if ever I want to break that relationship, I'm just going to click and drag here to select all of these, and then click this button, Unlink Selection. And then when I go back to move this parent, the kids won't follow because they are no longer kids. They've graduated from high school, they moved on. Anyways, let's go to File, Reset, No, Yes. And let's talk a little bit about inverse kinematics. Now, inverse kinematics is actually much more of an intermediate level topic. And as a matter of fact, there are a lot of topics that we're going to skip over that are much more basic than is inverse kinematics. But I want to mention it here because there usually isn't a good deal of information on this topic. When I was first learning Max a few years ago, And as I've browsed around the internet since, it's kind of hard to find a really good explanation of what inverse kinematics does and a simple description of how to set it up. So we'll do that here together now, even though you might not use this concept until a little bit further down the road in your exploration of 3ds Max. So I'm going to go to Systems and create another bone system here in the front view. Click, 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 and I'm going to right click. And we have a basic leg structure here. Thigh, calf, foot, and then hangy ball thing. This little hangy ball thing is actually called an end effector. I referred to this a little earlier, but we're actually going to use it now. Making sure that the end effector, this little nub at the end of the foot, is selected, let's go to the animation menu at the top, select IK Solvers, and then select IK Limb Solver. From there, we'll have an instant link saying, okay, where do you want the IK chain to end up? And I want it at the top of this bone here. So click, and we have ourselves an IK solver. Now, I'm actually going to hit Alt-W to maximize the front view. Pan this over a little bit, and I'm going to create another bone structure right next to it so we can kind of compare and contrast these two systems. It's probably the easiest way to understand what IK is really doing. I'm going to hit the letter W to get the Move tool. Now, as I move this foot, I'm moving it up, but I'm not really getting the chance to move it up for reals. At least not the way a human foot works. That's kind of frustrating. With an IK chain, we've created this solver and made this goal here, this little plus. And in this way, we don't animate the little bones, we animate the goal. So as I move the goal up, you'll see that this looks much more realistic. At least much more like the way a human would move their foot if they were raising their foot up. When we have a regular bone structure, we have what's called forward kinematics, meaning just what we talked about with parents. The children don't affect the parents, but the parents affect the kids. And so with inverse kinematics, we have the opposite, where parents can still affect kids, but kids can also affect parents. So if I move this bottom bone, that top thigh, well, that's moving too. And it's quite possible when you set up a character that you have several of these IK solvers. You'll probably have one for each leg, maybe one for each arm, and so forth. Again, I realize that this is a little bit advanced. I just want you to be aware of how to set this up. Later on down the road, you'll thank me. So let's put our newfound knowledge of rigging to the test and play a little bit with this werewolf file. This is the same one I used from a few movies ago, and you'll find it in the Chapter 10 folder. Now I actually want to first click on this red ring here around his waist. And I want to rotate it along the blue ring here, otherwise known as the Z-axis. So he's a little bit farther away. Let's also use the Move transform to close his mouth. Now we're ready to hit the N key, which will activate the auto key function. Let's move along a little bit in time. Go back to that red ring. Hit E for rotate. Along the blue ring again. Move that so he's now facing us kind of. And angry. And hit W for the Move tool. Select that diamond to control his jaw. Open it up. Let's actually select this red ring here. Hit the Rotate tool. Let's make him kind of cock back a little bit. There we go. Oh, he's mad. Oh, he's mad. Now let's go ahead and select these rings here. Hit W for the Move tool. Let's move his arm up. And keep hitting these arrows until we move his arm up in a way that you like. Again, yours doesn't have to follow mine. I'm just kind of fooling around here. And let's go ahead and hit the letter E to get the Rotate tool. Rotate that hand around. There we go. Now we can move it once it's rotated like that. There we go. Very nice. Let's hit the Home key. And hit the question mark. Ah ha ha, look at that. Super awesome. Now I'm finding that this timeline is a little bit long for me. I really only need it to go to about 50 frames. So I'm going to click on the time configuration dialog, change end time to 50 frames, and hit OK. Now we don't have to wait so long after our animation for it to repeat. Hit home, preview one more time, it loops more quickly. I like that. Now, of course, we could go through and play with the tangents of these keyframes. I'd probably want to speed them up a little bit. He looks like he's really angry, but he moves really slow, like a grandpa werewolf that's been slightly agitated. All the same, it's a great file to play with. Thanks again to my buddy David Gibbons for providing this for us. This model, along with many others of his models, are available for sale on turbosquid.com. You'll have to pay some serious cash for him there, but he's given this to us for free here, so super sweet. Thanks, Dave. Now we get to talk about Character Studio. Before getting started, I just want to let you know that a few versions ago, and prior to that, Character Studio was a separate application that you had to buy. I think it was like $400 or something. And now it just comes right in the package and installs right along with 3ds Max 9 and the last couple versions as well. And as a matter of fact, in 3ds Max 9, we see a lot more improvements added to the biped system, which is what we deal with when we're working in Character Studio. It's really a great system for animating characters. So let's show you how it works. Let's go back over to Systems where we created our Bones system. Instead of selecting Bones, let's just click Biped. And when we click and drag, we make our little character here. I'm going to right-click to cancel out of that here to show you that no matter where you click and what viewport, this figure still comes in at the same orientation. One of the very few things in Max to do that. I'm going to pan around to make sure I can see this here. I'm not going to use the Z shortcut to zoom extents. By default, when we select the entire biped, we actually select this little tiny diamond in the pelvis called the COM, or center of mass. So if I were to hit Z to zoom extents, well, we're going to zoom in and get a little too friendly with our biped. So I'm going to, in the perspective view, zoom out a little bit here. And once we've made this biped, we can scroll down to the bottom and adjust these options. This is a bad habit to get into, though. If we were to click outside or somehow deselect part of our biped and then come back here, we wouldn't be able to adjust anything. This is the way you probably should get in the habit of working when you're trying to adjust your biped. Go to the Motion tab, and with our biped selected, we get all sorts of biped options. Now, when you want to adjust the structure of your character, your structure of your biped, you must be in figure mode. Now, there might be a temptation at some point here or there to adjust the character when you're not in figure mode. Don't do that. That could result in some unexpected outcomes that you don't want. Trust me on that one. I'm going to zoom out in all these other viewports a little bit so I can have a better sense of what's going on here. By the way, if you did want to do a zoom extents on a biped, just hit Control-A to select all and then do a zoom extents. For right now, we're going to keep going here. Once figure mode is selected, we can open up structure and get the same options that we saw when we first created our biped. I'm actually going to make the perspective view just a little bit bigger. Usually I don't like working too much in the perspective view, except when it comes to bipeds. If I increase the amount of neck links, then he turns into a part giraffe here. I can also uncheck the arms button. If we're making a biped for a snake, for example, those arms might just get in the way. But I love my little biped enough to give him some arms this time around, so let's keep that checked. I can also increase the spine links, which is primarily for rigging purposes. We can increase the leg links and the tail links. As we bump this figure up, you'll see that we're increasing links to our tail. That's pretty awesome. You can also bump up the ponytail links, so our character could have a ponytail or two. Maybe if you were animating a horse and he needed a mane to blow in the distance, you could use the ponytail as a bone structure for the mane. And right now he just has one finger. It's basically a controller here, but we could bump these up if we need to have intricate finger movements. Also, we could bump up the finger lengths, which is really cool. Give it kind of a gorilla feel here. We do the same thing with toes and toe links as well. We could also add props, which will add a lot of the power of Character Studio to animating props. Let's say you wanted to animate a character swinging a sword. You could have a placeholder prop to do that. Increase the size of your biped by increasing or decreasing the height, and so forth. Now, while in figure mode, again, it's a good idea to do this in figure mode and not anywhere else. We can select, like the head, for example, hit R for scale, and give this guy a gargantuan head. Oh, that's awesome. This isn't just for fooling around. This really does serve an important purpose. If you were animating a character that had a very large head and a long neck, this would be the way to do it. And the point here is to get your biped to match your mesh as closely as possible. So as I go over to the front view here, I might select a shoulder and then scale this out. Maybe my character has broader shoulders than that. I'm going to right click to cancel, but again, that's the point here. It's not just to make a funny character, it's really for rigging purposes. Now let's see how easy this guy animates. I'm going to get him out of figure mode and hit the W key to access the move transform. Now watch as I click on one of his feet and then move it up. Does that movement look familiar? It should. This is an IK chain. It's already set up for you in the biped structure. Pretty awesome. Bipeds also have a lot of automated animation features that can really come in handy and save a lot of time. I'm going to actually make the top view a little bit bigger and zoom out in it. Boy, that's a monstrous head, isn't it? Let's go over and create some footsteps for this guy. Go into footstep mode over here next to figure mode. And with footsteps, what we're going to do is just place a series of footsteps, link them to our biped, and our biped will automatically walk in a pretty realistic way those footsteps that we lay down. We could choose to make walking footsteps. We could choose to have our biped run them or hop. It's kind of cute. For now, though, we're going to leave it on walk and select this button, Create Footsteps at Current Frame. So I'm going to click here and click, and you can see that the colors match up with the color of the legs. So the green footprints are where the green leg will go, and the blueprints are where the blue leg will go. So make these a little bit farther apart, make it a little bit more challenging, and maybe we could even spread them apart, see how he does with that. Maybe make them a little bit close together. Very good. So you see this walk cycle that he's going to do now, created very quickly and very easily. Now there's still one more critical step. If we were to scrub the timeline, nothing would animate. What we have to do is make these footsteps active. And the way that we do that is with this button, Create Keys for Inactive Footsteps. As we do, notice the color of the footsteps. This should be a very clear indicator to you if footsteps are active or inactive. Click here, and notice these footsteps kind of become a faded green and a faded blue, and our character is already about to walk on this path here. So let's make the perspective view a little bit bigger. We could watch our large-headed freak, gorilla, kangaroo, Joey Jojo Jr. Shabadoo freak walk this path. Let's go ahead and hit the question mark. There he goes. Step in bigger and step in smaller. Awesome. And you saw how few steps it took to get him to walk those steps. That is so cool. Hit the question mark to stop that. And that's all we need to cover as far as setting up our biped here. But using these footsteps creatively can do much more than just walk cycles. You can make your character dance the two-step. And actually, I don't even know what the two-step is, honestly. But you could make your character dance that way. And of course, there's much more you could do with Character Studio. You don't really have the control and flexibility that you do with Bones, but at the same time, everything's so easy to set up and rig. It's kind of a nice little feature. Let's continue on talking about a few more sweet features of Character Studio. In this section, we're going to cover using motion capture files. And I realize that this seems like a weird place to start. This is actually the installer for 3ds Max 9. The reason why I'm starting here is because motion capture files used to be included with the Max install. If you want to include them now, you'll need to go over to the Resources tab of the installer, select Samples, and then look in this folder, the Motion folder. It's here you'll have access to all the motion capture files that you need. or at least a load of them to get started with. Now I went ahead and already copied the motion folder to my 3ds Max 9 root directory. So I'm going to close this installer, get back in Max. And let's go to our systems area, make a biped. Very good. And let's go over to the motion tab. Scroll down to the motion capture area at the bottom. You might need to expand it to be able to see these buttons here. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with motion capture, let me explain what that is. As you can imagine, it can be pretty tedious to sit here and animate every single nook and cranny of a character to go along with a complex action. To simplify and expedite that process, we can create a motion capture. And this is done by putting on a suit. You may have seen this somewhere before. People put on typically a black suit, and it looks like they have ping pong balls all over them. And they act out a scene. Cameras record the location of the ping pong balls. A file is then created that tracks that action, and then we can apply that to our biped here. If you're familiar with the Lord of the Rings trilogy by Peter Jackson, many of the special features on the DVD demonstrated motion capture, as Andy Serkis, who acted out the character of Gollum, used this same technique. Now watch how easy this is. This is probably one of the most fun parts of all of 3ds Max. I could literally spend an entire day just playing with these. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And to load a motion capture file, just hit this button. We can choose from a BIP file, a BVH file, or a CSM file. I'm going to stick with the BIP. And again, I'm in my 3ds Max 9 root directory, and then the motion folder that I added from the samples folder, accessed via the installer. Open up motion, and again, we're looking at BIP files, so I'm going to go into the BIP folder. And we have all these categories. Fight's kind of a fun folder to explore here. Let's check out Cartwheel Punch, and hit open. Hit OK, hit OK. And all of a sudden, our character's in a new, interesting, and different position. It's exciting, folks. Let's go ahead and hit the question mark. Woo! And instantly, we have a cartwheel punch and a cool pose thing. But all done with essentially the click of a button. Now, you probably don't have a motion capture studio at your disposal to be able to capture motion, but all the same, there are places all over the internet to get free ones. And again, there's just libraries of freebies that ship with Max. Now, if you're going to do a search on this, motion capture in the biz is often referred to as mocap, as a little abbreviation. So if you see mocap, that's actually what you're looking for. Okay, now we've talked about making this biped. We've made him literally jump up and dance, and then flip and punch and block. Now let's try to get this guy to animate a mesh of our creating. So we've talked about creating, adjusting, and animating bipeds. Now it's time to link up a character to our Character Studio biped. And what better character to use than our old buddy Herbie the Robot. So let's go to File, Open, and in the Chapter 11 folder of your exercise files, open up Robot, and click Open. Now, to save time and tremendous amounts of boredom on your part, I went ahead and already made the Character Studio biped and adjusted him to fit. I think you know by now how to scale and adjust and whatnot. So basically what I did was to scale this biped so that it more accurately fits our mesh. Now, as you'll soon see, I didn't do a very good job of this. For example, I left the legs still very narrow, whereas my robot's legs are pretty wide. Just by way of contrast, I'm going to select this calf on the left leg. And by the way, when you're dealing with a character, the point of reference is never your point of reference. It's always the character's point of reference. So even though this leg is on my right, this is still the left leg because this is Herbie's left leg. So I'm going to scale this up. Oops. Maybe we should scale it in this axis here. Okay, so now this leg here stretches back a little bit farther than the green one. Let's see if that helps us when we apply this biped to our mesh. Now, if I select the mesh, you'll notice that it's frozen. So I actually can't select it. So let's go ahead and unfreeze all so that we can select our mesh, because we want to apply this biped to our mesh. And so to do that, we have to select our mesh, go to the Modify tab, and under the modifier list, select the physique modifier. Again, don't get those confused. We apply a skin modifier to mesh to attach it to bones. We apply a physique modifier to mesh to apply it to a biped. And here we have this button attached to node. The node that we want is actually the COM, the center of mass, that blue diamond. This is oftentimes hard to select here, so I'm going to select attach to node, and then I'm going to hit H for my hit list to be able to select my object. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of biped objects here. But BIP01, the one that doesn't say any other body part on it, is actually the center of mass. Click that, hit pick. We'll get this dialog box, just hit initialize. And there we go. Our mesh is now linked to our biped. Now I'm going to make the perspective view a little bit bigger and zoom in to the left here. As I click that green foot, ooh, I get some ugly stretching stuff. That's not good. Let's see if this one turned out any better on the blue side. Oh, look at that. Even though the rest of the leg is bad, the calf is significantly better than it is on this side, because we made the bone structure a little bit bigger. So again, a lot of rigging is going through and making sure that all of your bones are the right size so that when you rig, either the skin or the physique modifier knows how to properly skin your mesh onto your biped. Now, we're not totally out of luck. As a matter of fact, most of the time when you apply a mesh to a biped or other skeletal system, you have to go back and tweak it just a little bit. And hence the non-fun part of rigging. So let's go ahead and select our mesh and go to the sub-object level of physique and click on envelope. And when we click on one of our bones here, specifically the yellow line that you'll see running through these bones, we have access to the envelope. Now, I typically don't do this, but you can. In this orthographic view, I'm going to arc rotate. So it's going to be kind of like a 3D, 2D view. Now, the areas that are red are completely attached to the biped. Areas that are purple are kind of attached to the biped. So in order to make this bone, in a sense, so in order to make this mesh on the back of the calf attach better to this bone, for lack of a better term, of this biped, then we scroll down here under our envelope options, and we could bump up radial scale, for example. And that makes a bigger envelope. Now all these points are selected, meaning that they will for sure be affected by this here envelope and this here bone. Now as I go to the top level, select the right foot, hit W for the move tool, move that around. You'll see that even though the thigh still has problems, and so does the toe, the calf is better because we adjusted the envelope. And essentially that's rigging. We have to go through all of these envelopes, making sure that the envelopes of each part of every bone completely covers the mesh so we don't have any of these tugged vertices, which look awful. And it's a good reminder to set up your mesh a little bit bigger, especially for the extremities, the hands, the feet, the head. We want them to be a little bit bigger. As a matter of fact, I have this huge head that completely encompasses Herbie's head. But you'll notice, as I click on the head and rotate, the head probably does better than anything else here. So that's typically the way we work with extremities. And you can see as I look through my mesh that I didn't do a very good job of setting it up, that I should have made these bones a little bit thicker. And then when I skinned it with the physique modifier, it would have worked a little bit better. And that, my friends, is an overview of Character Studio. For this basic intro into lighting, we don't even need Max open. Let's just go to the exercise files folder and open up chapter 12. We'll see two images here. werewolf boring lighting, and werewolf lit well. Now, I know that there are probably more than a few of you out there that are very skeptical about why you need to learn lighting. Well, let me make a believer out of you. Many newcomers to the world of 3D often overlook lighting as one of the most powerful tools in creating a believable scene. But if you were to ask most 3D artists out there the two most important things, they probably would say materials and lighting. And maybe not even in that order. Let me show you briefly here the difference lights can make. I'm first going to open up werewolf boring lighting. This should look pretty familiar to you. This is the werewolf we used previously when we were talking about rigging. Again, thanks to David Gibbons, my lead animator at Wedgecase Animation, for providing this for us. But this is the werewolf with basic lighting. There are no shadows, no highlights, nothing really exciting to speak of in the way of lighting. I can see every piece of this equally. Now, there is a little bit of faking here with some shadows and some highlights, but that's painted into the material, not part of lighting. And truth be told, this is actually a pretty good trick if you're working on a video game character and you want to have lighting on the character in certain areas, but you can't get the game engine to render the lighting model that quickly. You could bake the lighting information into the character so that it always has that lighting information as part of the material. But with all the lighting, we see all the imperfections. This is a low poly model meant for gaming. And with the lights at full blast here, it's kind of unforgiving. We can see points like this that really don't belong. We can also see where there's some stretching in the materials. And basically every other little tiny flaw about this character. Now we're going to look at the same exact scene. The same max file, the same mesh, the same materials applied to it. Everything is the exact same except for the lighting. I'm going to close boring lighting and open up werewolf lit well. Oh, hey, look at that. Man, I love lighting. Whereas before, when this thing was lit up like a Christmas tree, we could see all that stretching on those paws there. And instead here, we're just seeing subtle highlights along the edges of those claws. Much more menacing and mean. Also, the light has a blue tint, as if this werewolf is out late at night hunting by the light of the moon. I also put a red light here next to his eye to bring out that mean glare in his eye. I put another light under his mouth to kind of give it that scary campfire thing when you put your flashlight under your mouth, when you're a kid. Always does a great job in making things look a little bit creepier. Also makes his teeth look a little bit more menacing because they're lit up. And so we could use lighting like this to put emphasis where we want that. I'm going to hit the right arrow key while we're in the Windows Picture and Fax Viewer here to go back to my other image. Wow, what a difference. This looks like a low poly character, but as we change the lighting, what a difference. And not only that, going back to the original again, there's no emphasis here. Should we look at his face? Should we be scared of his claws? Is this some kind of werewolf-scorpion hybrid? Maybe he has a scary tail back here that we should be aware of? Who knows? But when we light this properly, we could put the emphasis where we want it. And in this one, I chose to light up his teeth a little bit and his eye. It's almost as if to say, I'm focused on you, and I have the teeth to chew you up and destroy you. Again, I remind you here, the only difference is the lighting. I didn't change the rendering engine or anything else about the file, only the lighting. But lights don't only make images look better, they also can help us tell a story. The angle of our lights, for example, and where they're placed can also aid in our storytelling. Let's say, for example, we have a light coming from up above somebody. If it was coming from straight up above them, it might appear to be heavenly, putting our character in perhaps an innocent light. If we stuck a light under a character's chin, for example, that old campfire trick that we just talked about, a character might appear a little bit more menacing and mean. The intensity of the light also makes a difference. This character looks a lot more creepy and evil because we can't really see all of him. If we had massive highlights that were blown out so that this looked all ethereal and smooth and angelic, it would definitely take away some of the power of this scene, to say the least. A werewolf entering the pearly gates of heaven because of his good deeds somehow isn't quite as scary. And finally, we could also change the color of our lights to help tell a story as well. Now, this is not the time and the place to talk about the psychology of color, but suffice it to say, color makes a huge difference in the way we as human beings react. There's a reason that stop signs are red. When you think of red, you think of things that are passionate, fiery, warm, intense. things that are blue are often a little bit more chilled out and relaxed. And so then, if you had a character that was full of rage and was going and destroying a room, you probably wouldn't want the scene to be full of blue light. So this is just a teaser, a warm-up if you will, into what lights have to offer to your scene. Sometimes lights in the real world don't really serve a great purpose. You just turn on a light so you can see where you're going. But as animators, we kind of tell a story. We use lights in a different way. Yes, we use lights to illuminate things so we can see where we're going, all that stuff, yada yada, blah blah blah, whatever. But realistically, the power of lights is to put focus where we want focus and to use colors, angles, and intensity to help us tell our story. Now let's get into Max and actually make some of these lights and see how this works. So let's talk about making lights. Now, the first lights we need to talk about are the default lights. You might have noticed if we created a sphere, say for example in the top view, selected the perspective viewport and hit the F9 key to render, we already have kind of a light source. As you can see, the back side of the sphere kind of trails off into the darkness a little bit. And that's because Max already creates a default lighting system. It's actually kind of cool because if you want to just jump into the program and start modeling, you don't have to create this really complex lighting rig so that you can see all the parts of your character while you're modeling. Now here's what you really need to know about these default lights though. Once you add your own lights to the scene, the default lights, which are relatively powerful, are immediately turned off. This can be really frustrating for new users because once you add a light, sometimes it can actually be darker than before you added the light. But that's why, because the default lights usually do a pretty good job of adding light. Once you add your own, those default lights turn off. So just remember that as we go through this here. I'm going to close this render window, hit the delete key to get rid of the sphere. Now we're going to go over to the command panel here, and we have the create tab, and we've created geometry and shapes. Now let's create some lights. Now there's three basic types of light that we're going to be talking about in this training series. Spotlights, these two at the top. Next level down we have direct lights. And we're also going to be talking about omni lights. And before we actually create a light, let's make an object to light. We're going to go back to geometry very quickly, select plane, and in the top view, just click and drag to create a plane. I'm actually going to change the color of this to be a little bit darker so it's more obvious to see our lighting. This blue is really sticking out to me right now. Boy, that's an awesome shade of blue. Okay, let's go over to lights real quick. And let's go ahead and add a target spot. I'm going to lower this a little bit so I can see my plane. And then when I add my light here, I'll be able to see it a little bit better. Let's start out with the good old target spot. A very popular choice for lighting. And in the front view, I'm going to click and drag down. And once I'm about here, a little bit below my plane, I'm going to let go. And you can see even in the viewport, our light showing up on the surface of our plane. I'm going to select the perspective viewport, hit F9, and you can see where our spotlight is hitting our plane. And it's flat in these areas because that's where the plane ends. Let me close this render window here. Let me explain what we're seeing here. We have the top of the light here. This white part is called the cone. And that's actually what's beaming the light. And because we created a target spot, this light also has a target. That's what this little square here is. If I select the Move Transform here, and then come back down to this target, I could select the target and move that around. You'll notice that the light on our plane changes as we move the target around. So the cone is what shoots out our light, and the target is where it's pointed. And if you look in the top and left views, you'll see that we actually have a cone here. And as you can see from our render that we did a couple seconds ago, this cone that tells us where our light is going to show up doesn't actually render. Think of this as a gizmo for lights. It's just a little helper so we can visually see where our light is coming from and where it's going. And I'm going to delete that, and I want to talk about the free spot. As you saw with the spotlight, we had that target that we can move around. Sometimes you may not want to deal with a target. Say, for example, you're making headlights on a car, and you always want those headlights to face forward. Having a target to get in the way will make it much more difficult to animate those headlights. So we can create a free spot here. Now, a general rule, typically you'd want to create target lights in a side view, either front, left, or right. And typically you'd want to create free lights, either free spot or free direct, in the top view. The orientation when you create them is a little bit different. So I just click once here, and you just get one shot when you're making a free light. You just click once and it's in your scene. I'm going to hit W for the move tool so I can move this above our plane. Notice in the front view here that our light is below the plane. So it's going to render as pitch black because it's not getting any light. And because the default lights are off in our scene because we have a light here, we're not getting any lighting on this plane at all. So if in the front view I move it up a little bit, you'll see there our free spotlight. So a spotlight, again, means that it has a cone. It broadcasts or shoots out light in this shape. Target lights have a target to aim at, and free lights just shoot out light in one direction. Of course, I could select, for example, the letter E to get to the rotate tool, and then I could move this around, thusly. So I could still move this around, animate it, that type of thing. But I don't have a target. I'm just going to right-click to cancel out of that. Let me delete this here. Let's talk about these direct lights. I'm going to make this target direct light, and because, again, it's a target light, I'm going to create it in the front view so that the bottom of my scene can be illuminated here. Now, direct lights create directional light. It's basically a whole array of parallel light rays. And the point of a direct light is to mimic the rays of the sun, for example, where you have a whole mess of light all beaming in one direction. It doesn't start from a single point like a spot and then branch out. It's all coming from one huge area. Let's click on the perspective window and render that. And we get a similar result here as we did with the spotlight. But once you have an entire scene, it makes a big difference. I'm going to close that. I'm going to delete this now. A free direct light, again, better created in the top view for our purposes here. It's the same type thing as the free spot. There's no point to control, just the direction of the initial light. Okay, I'm going to delete that. The final one I want to mention here is an Omni light. And notice that there are not target or free versions of Omni, just an Omni. Well, an Omni is kind of cool. Just click it once, and it just shoots out light in all directions, kind of like a light bulb. It doesn't have any kind of direction or focus whatsoever. You just put it in a scene, and it lights up everything around it. Now, let's go ahead and close this out. And I want to share with you a really standard lighting setup called 3-point lighting. We'll get to that in the next segment. We're going to start this lesson using the 3pointlight.max file in the Chapter 12 folder. Now, don't worry about messing with anything here. Both the torus knot and the wood plane have been locked down and frozen. Let's go ahead and select the perspective viewport and render that to see what we have so far. So basically, we have a somewhat glassy torus knot on top of a wooden table. I realize it's not the best wood table, just bear with me. I didn't want to take the time to apply any maps to this and then take a risk that you wouldn't have those maps. Just a headache we really don't need to deal with for this example, so it's just brown and shiny. So let's go ahead and close this render window. And what we're going to talk about here is 3-point lighting. Often, newcomers to animation will be confused about how they should set up a lighting rig. Where do I even get started? Do I put lights really far away from objects? Do I put lights really close to the objects? How many should I have? Etc., etc. Well, like most things in Max, that's an art form. Figuring out where to put lights and when to use them and how far away they should be, well, that's just not something we're going to cover in an Essentials title. But I want to give you this trick here, 3-point lighting. This is a standard way to light an object, whether you're in a photo studio or whether you're animating a 3D scene. And basically, 3-point lighting is called 3-point lighting because it utilizes 3 lights. A key light, a fill light, and a backlight. Let's talk about how this works. I'm going to go to the top viewport and the front viewport and zoom out just a little bit so I can see what's going on. And under the Create tab of the Command panel, select Lights. And let's create a target spot in the front viewport about where our torus knot is. Now, we're not seeing it in the perspective viewport because of the lowered opacity of the glass material that I applied to it. But it was there when we rendered, so we're all good. Now, it's important as we work in the perspective viewport to be aware of what angle we're looking at this when we're looking in the orthographic views. So if you look in the top view here, you can tell that my camera angle is basically coming in from this direction. So I'm going to right-click and select Move, and then move this spotlight over just a little bit. I usually like my key lights to be over kind of at an angle as opposed to straight on. In my opinion, that works best for most scenes. So as I just kind of alluded to, this first spotlight is our key light, the first point of the 3-point lighting setup. The key light is going to be the most important light. If, with this spotlight selected, we go over to the Modify tab, we'll get some options for this light. We'll talk more about these a little later, but I want to open up the menu that says Intensity, Color, and Attenuation. I talk about this multiplier very briefly. The multiplier talks about the intensity of the light. By default, lights come in at a 1.0 intensity level. And for the key light, that's going to work just fine. We're going to come back to this momentarily when we talk about the other lights that are not the key lights and take down their intensity just a little bit. We'll do that by going here. I'm also going to use this rollout here to turn on shadows by checking this checkbox. The second light I'm going to add as I go to the Create tab, making sure that Lights is selected here, I'm going to create an Omni about over here somewhere. Now, Omnis kind of come in on the floor, so I'm going to hit the letter W and then bring that light up a little bit, maybe move it over just a little bit. And again, this is our fill light. We get our shadows and our specular highlights out of our main first point light. But that's generally not enough light to look really good. So we bring in a fill light just to kind of add some ambient light throughout our scene. I'm going to go to the Modify tab though, and take this multiplier down quite a bit, maybe to 0.6 or so. Finally, we add our third point. Our third point is the backlight. It's generally a good idea to have light coming from behind an object, especially if you're working in 3D. This not only fills the scene with a little bit more ambient light, but also, because it's backlit, it tends to highlight the edges of an object and adds a little bit more 3D-ness, if I could make up a word real quick, making our object look like it has a little bit more dimension to it. Now I need to create another Omni, the third point in our 3-point lighting setup, so I could just go back to the Create tab and make one, or I could use the good old cloning shortcut, Shift, to shift move this Omni light over and put that behind our object. The perspective view is giving us a good idea of where that's going to go. I'm going to let go here, just make a copy, and a 0.6 intensity is probably okay for the backlight. So now we have our 3-point lighting set up. Point 1, the key light, the most powerful light, the light where we usually have our shadows coming from. We have the point 2 light, the fill light, to fill our scene with a little bit more ambient light. And finally, we have the third light, the backlight, to light the back of the object, giving us a little bit more light, but more importantly, rounding out those edges so that we have 3 dimensions to our object. Let's select the perspective viewport and hit F9 one more time to render and see how this looks. Ooh, much cooler, much cooler. We see the shadow being cast here. We have our key light. This just looks significantly better. And it also should be pointed out real quick here as we're looking at this, that our material changes based on light. If I were to delete these now, this reflection would look much worse than it does now. And again, lighting and materials really work hand in hand to make an object more believable. Let's go ahead and start this scene off with a fresh reset. File, reset. Yes. Let's go ahead and create 2 teapots in the top view. Then let's go over to the lights area and create an Omni above these in the front view. I'm going to zoom out a little bit in the perspective view and hit F9 to render to see what we have. Boy, I just love lights. Those are just plain old boring teapots. They're kind of low poly teapots. There's these flat, ugly edges here. But even still, that just looks so much cooler than the stuff we've been dealing with so far. Lights just do so much to your scene. Anyways, let's go and close this rendered window. And with that Omni light selected, let's go to the Modify tab. And let's talk about some of these options once we create a light. The first option we have here is whether or not we want the light on or off. That's kind of cool. A great way to see a before and after, what a difference a light makes to a scene. There's also this light type drop down here. So if we want to change this to a spotlight or a directional light or back to an Omni, from right here we can do that. This is also where we will turn shadows on and off. I'll talk a little bit more about shadows in detail in the next segment. There's also this really cool exclude button. Hit that. And basically what this will allow us to do is to exclude or include certain objects from our scene. We could remove them from illumination, in other words, light, so that maybe our light doesn't shine on that object, or we could just exclude it from shadow casting. So in case an object is casting a weird shadow in our scene on a character or some other place where we don't want that shadow to be, we could exclude shadow casting from an object. Or we could do both. And for right now, we're just going to select both. Now you could select exclude to tell a light what objects not to shine on or not to cast shadows with. Or we could select include. Let's say we have a scene full of thousands of objects and we only want to illuminate one object a little bit more. If we include that object, then every other object in our scene will not be affected by that light. So we have two options here to get this over into this area. If we want to do an include or exclude, we need to make sure that our object goes here to do it. The area on our left is a list of the objects in our scene. So we can click this button or simply double click the object to get it over on the right hand side. Teapot 01 will now be included in the light. Teapot 02 will not be included in the light. Let's go ahead and hit OK. And again, in the perspective view, let's render this. See that? Very cool. And it's non-destructive. So at any time I can hit the include button and just double click this to get it back to where it was and hit OK. Render again, and it's been undone. And actually, I left it on include and I included no objects, so we have nothing in our scene. I'm going to go back to include and hit exclude. So now we're excluding none instead of including none and hit OK. There we go. All is right with the world. Close that window. Let's go back to talking about some of these options here. The multiplier, as we talked about before, is the intensity of our light. And as you might have noticed, a little bit of adjusting goes a long way with this spinner. So if I take this down to 5, even halfway, and we render that, that's significantly darker. Likewise, if I go to a seemingly innocent number like 2 and render that, well, then these teapots are having some kind of vision or something. That's way too bright. Now let me show you another secret trick. A lot of people don't know about this. I'm going to go to the Create tab, and I'm going to create a target spot in the front view. And actually, let's just hit W so we get access to the Move Transform. And let's move that point so it's shining directly on that green teapot. Let's render that. Wow, that's really bright. Let me close this here. Go back to select your Omni and go to the Modify tab. One of the things that you could actually do with the multiplier is go into a negative number. So you could actually suck out light. So let's just render this real quick, hitting F9 to see where we are as a starting point. Okay, remember that. Close this window. And now let's take down this Omni and go back to 1. Or we could just select it and type 1. And let's render one more time, hitting F9. And this is the way it looks with the Omni at 1, with the multiplier of 1. Now, if I close this down, I could actually take this multiplier into a negative number to suck out light. And you'll see that when it goes to 0, if we just right-click on it, this is what it looks like without the Omni in our scene. But as we take the Omni into a negative number, it's almost like the nothing from the Neverending Story. It's just taking over our scene, sucking out that which is wholesome and decent in life. Actually, it's just reducing the light that's already there. So I'm actually just going to type 1 here to get back to my standard Omni light settings. Now, we could also change the color of our light with this swatch here. By default, lights come in at white, which is generally a good idea. When you start talking about lights in Max, it's just like lights in the real world. It can be tricky. If you find that you're having a real difficult time with the color of your lights, or if you just want to be a master of how it works, I recommend going down to the local community college and taking a class in theater lighting. The way that light works is very interesting. I remember watching some special features on the Finding Nemo DVD, and they were talking about the problems that they were having lighting Nemo. Nemo, as you might remember, was a little orange fish, and a little orange fish in a blue ocean is pretty hard to light. Most stuff in the ocean, Pixar lighted with a blue light. However, Nemo couldn't be lighted with that blue light because an orange surface under a blue light doesn't turn more orange. There's a lot of issues to play with here. So let's go ahead and take that white color swatch to change the color of our light, at least our Omni light. If I change this to red and hit close, render again. You can see what a huge difference that makes. That brownish teapot now looks like it's red. Usually when you're adjusting lights, especially the color of a light, it's usually a good idea to have very subtle hints of light, never a full-blown color. So if we want a reddish light, it's best to stick to a color in this general region, maybe a little bit darker, but not too much. Now if I hit F9 to render, you see we still have a very pinkish tint here. As I take this back to white, hit close, and re-render again, watching this color, you'll see that it was a very subtle change, but it made a difference. I'm going to close this window. All right, let's talk about attenuation. And I use far attenuation far more than I use near attenuation. So let's just stick to far attenuation for right now. Now, I'm going to select Use Far Attenuation to turn it on. And what attenuation does is it allows you to fade in using near attenuation or fade out using far attenuation the light. So as we click on far attenuation and zoom out a little bit, we get this additional gizmo. Let me turn it on and off again so you can see the difference. Off, on. We have these two additional lines here. Well, the first line here indicates where the light will be full intensity. Or in other words, in this dialog here, the start of our fade. This outside line represents the end of our fade, or where the light will completely fade out. This is absolutely essential for creating really smooth, realistic lighting effects. But not only that, folks, and this is another little secret, this also really ends in rendering time. When we turn on casting shadows, the light will then stop on whatever it hits first. And again, we're going to talk about shadows more in the next segment. But it's important to know that because if you don't have shadows turned on, your light will keep broadcasting and shooting out those light rays throughout infinity. That will add to your render time. As you turn on attenuation, the light will have a finite end. It will not keep broadcasting forever. It will stop once it reaches this end attenuation line. Now, very briefly, let's go ahead and select the spotlight that we created. And as we scroll down, you'll see that we have another little area here called Spotlight Parameters. Open that up, and there's a couple fields I want you to be aware of here. Hotspot and Fall Off. As I adjust hotspot or beam, I'm going to actually take it down. You'll see that we have the inside of our cone that we're adjusting here. And the fall off is the outside ring. This kind of works the same way attenuation does. The light is going to be in full strength in this area, the light blue circle, and it will gradually fade out as it goes outwards towards the fall off circle. And after the fall off circle, there won't be any more spotlight to be had. One other little trick here. If we go to the Tools menu at the top and select towards the top Light Lister, we get this handy little tool for going through our lights. We can turn lights on and off from here. We can select lights using these gray buttons here. Notice in our scene, the Omni is selected, then the Spotlight is selected. We can name them. Call this Teapot Omni. Hit Enter. Adjust the multiplier, color, turn on shadows, change the type of shadows, basic shadow parameters, etc., etc. If you have tons of lights in your scene and you just want to adjust the parameters of the light you have selected, hit Selected Light, and this area here that does get pretty filled up when you have a lot of lights in your scene will reduce to only the lights that you have selected. Now it should be noted as well, if I close this light lister here, that we could also hide lights. As you can imagine, having this noise and junk in your scene can get a little distracting. But if I select a light that's on, and I right-click on it and I say Hide Selection to get rid of this target spotlight in our scene, we'll see that even though the light is hidden, it doesn't turn off. The power of that spotlight is still here. I'm going to right-click and select Unhide All. And if I select this spotlight and go up to the top and turn it off, you'll see that it makes a significant difference, and that's not what we saw when we hid it. So turning a light on and off is not equivalent to hiding it, which is actually pretty cool because we typically want lights in our scene once we have them, but we don't necessarily want to look at these gizmos all the time. Now, we kind of briefed over shadows a little bit, but shadows are an absolutely essential part of making good lighting. So let's go talk about shadows specifically in the next segment. Shadows are one of the most important parts of using lights effectively in 3ds Max or any 3D application. Let's build a quick little scene here to demonstrate what we're talking about. Let's create a plane in the top view. And let's go to Extended Primitives and create a Hedra. Select star 2. And in the top view, let's make a Hedra. Actually, let's make that star 1. Cool spike ball. That's awesome. Go over to the Modify tab. Actually, let's take down the scaling. It's kind of interesting when you take down the scaling of these different features of the Hedra. Definitely different results than when you bump up the radius of a sphere, for example, because you're actually scaling the different pieces of the Hedra here. It's kind of exciting. But I actually want this to be smaller. So I'm going to hit the Scale tool, hit R, and let's just scale this down very quickly. That looks about right. Move it up in the top view. And we'll actually have this cut into our plane just a little bit. Let's arc rotate around so we can see what's going on here. Now let's go to the Create tab again and create a spotlight in the front view. And make sure you get around so that you could see the back side of this Hedra as the light's hitting it so we could see what's going on in the world of shadows behind it here. Let's go ahead and hit F9 to render that. Very good. Now, with the spotlight selected, let's go to the Modify tab. And let's scroll up to the top here if you're not already there. We talked before that you just hit this checkbox to turn a light on or off. You could also simply right-click on a light, and it might be more convenient for you to turn on Cast Shadows. And this right-click menu is actually very helpful. From here, you could select the light target. You could choose whether or not to affect specular highlights or diffuse, or maybe only the ambient light of objects. I mean, typically you'd want this set up in the default way, but it does really help to know that you can change this if you need to. For now, I'm just going to select Cast Shadows from here. And now shadows are on. Let's select the perspective viewport and render again. Very interesting. So we're seeing not only the shadow behind, but we're seeing that it's actually really casting shadows. These little spikes right here now have shadows behind them. These spikes here have shadows behind them. And so on and so forth through this entire object. Shadows make such a difference. And you know what? Let's actually go to the top view real quick and clone this Hedra, making another copy of itself behind it. Let's go ahead and just make a regular copy and hit OK. Now, I'm actually going to right-click on my spotlight and turn off Cast Shadows, render again, and you'll see that both of these lights are being completely affected by this light. It makes no difference that they're behind one another. This Hedra is not getting in the way of this Hedra getting light in any degree. However, again, if we select Shadows, we see a different story. Let's hit F9. See, this one is actually now covered in shadow. So again, if you don't have shadows on, your lights are going to shoot out for eternity. If you turn them on, they stop at whatever they hit first. So be aware of that. I'm going to select this Hedra and delete it. And select our spotlight one more time. Now also under the shadows area, as I mentioned before, we can turn this on or off, or we could change the type of shadow. The default is shadow map, and because it's the default, it's pretty widely used. It's definitely not the best shadow solution, but it's one that's used pretty commonly, and so that's the one we're going to focus on in this particular segment. But there are other more sophisticated options. Ray trace shadows, for example, if we render this, render hard-edged shadows. It's practically impossible to get ray trace shadows to make these nice soft shadows, but they are a little bit more accurate. I'm going to close this, and again, I'm just going to go back to shadow map because that's the one we're going to be focusing on here. Let's close up these other rollouts here, so they don't get in our way. And let's open up shadow parameters. Now we're only going to cover these two top ones here. We could change the color of our shadow. Let's do something really hideous. It's like green or something. And let's render that. Ugh. That looks hideous. And you might wonder, well, why would I ever want to change the shadow color? It's good for objects that you want to have a degree of light transmission, meaning that they cast the color of the object itself onto the other surface. Say, for example, if you have a stained glass, you wouldn't want the shadow going through your stained glass window to be black. You'd want it to be the color of the stained glass. Changing the color of the shadows is one way to do that. We're going to select this here and take this all the way back down to black. Hit close. We also here have the density of our shadow. This is like the opacity of our shadow. So if we take this down and render, you'll see that our shadow is faded. Bump this up. Bumped up really high here. You see we have a very thick, solid black shadow. Leave this set to 1. Close up shadow parameters here. open up shadow map parameters. Now, shadow map parameters is actually the one you're probably going to be using the most as you're adjusting your shadow map shadow. Now, this is actually pretty complex, more complex than it seems on the surface anyway. But when Max casts shadows, it actually creates a bitmap of the shadow area and then applies that during rendering. And I realize it's a little technical and nerdy to talk about, but it's really essential to understanding what's going on here. More on that in a second. Let's explain a few of these basic settings here. Bias determines the closeness of the shadow to the object. So right now, we have a little bit of distance here from our shadow and our object. Let's say we bump this up to 200 and render. So again, bias controls the closeness of the shadow to the object. Bumping this up to 200, as we'll see when we hit F9, once our perspective viewport is selected, brings the shadow very close. Very, very, very close. Let's take this down to a more realistic number here. Let's try 26 and hit F9. There's our shadow. Let's take this back down to 1 and then go back and select our perspective viewport and render this. Now our shadow's a little bit farther away here. And again, you might be wondering, why would I want to change the bias? Well, if you notice, different times of day, shadows change their length. If the sun's at high noon, then it's usually going to be directly overhead, and shadows will be very close together. Next, we have sample range. Sample range is basically a complicated way of saying a blur applied to your shadow. As I bump up sample range, then I hit F9, you'll see that our shadow is kind of blurred out of existence here. Take this back down to 4. Now, a lot of people try to bump up the sample range to compensate for jaggy edges that sometimes show up in shadow map shadows. Let's hit F9 to render again with our sample range where it was at before, and we'll see some kind of stickly, ugly stuff happening with our shadow here. And so, yes, blur will fix this, but it'll also make a softer edge shadow than you might want. The real problem here is that the resolution of the shadow map that I mentioned, that bitmap that Max creates, is a little bit too low. So that's why we have this size parameter. We're going to bump up the resolution of the shadow map. Let's take this, for example, to 1024 and hit render. See, these shadows clean up considerably. Now, it might slow down our render time a tad, but you don't want to have ugly shadows. It's not worth it. It's worth the few seconds that you might have to spend while you're rendering to make sure that those shadows look really nice and clean. And ladies and gentlemen, in a nutshell, that's lights in 3ds Max. So now that we've set up our scene and gone through the core of setting up a great environment inside of 3ds Max, we need to film it. Let's go talk about cameras. Cameras are a chief vehicle in creating great 3D animation because cameras are a great vehicle in telling a great story. And if you think about it, it's usually the view through the camera that tells your story. Think of cameras as a viewer's window into your environment, the story that you're creating, the scene that you've made. And in the same way that lights aid us in telling our story, so too do cameras as well. Let's go to the exercise files. Let's open up chapter 13. Basically, these are a couple pictures of Herbie the robot, and they are renders taken from different angles. Let's see what it looks like when the camera is placed above Herbie looking down. Herbie looks so poor and lonely sitting there by himself, doesn't he? Are you there, God? It's me, Herbie. And so shooting a character with the camera above it tends to minimize or demean a character to make them seem weak or fragile, helpless, and that type of thing. However, if we take the same model and place a camera below it looking up, we get a much different feel. Now, this is the same model, but Herbie looks very powerful, majestic, triumphant, and all those type of things. And I realized that he would probably look more powerful if he had hands, but there's no hands. Still, though, he just looks more majestic, more respectable, more like a hero. And you see these camera angles used all the time in Hollywood. I remember in Spider-Man 2, when Peter Parker had his girlfriend stolen by Dr. Octopus, and he had his big Popeye moment. His, I've taken all I can stands and I can't stands no more. And so he stood up and he threw off his glasses, and the camera angle was from the bottom looking up, and boy, he just looked so tough. And it wasn't really that it was Peter Parker, the king of the nerds, looking tough. It was the camera angle that made him seem so powerful. Now again, just like with lights and with color, There's way too much about blocking, in other words, setting stuff in your scene and positioning cameras and all that kind of stuff to cover here. But if you really want to become a scholar on this subject, I recommend becoming a student of Alfred Hitchcock films. Hitchcock was a master of using camera angles to tell a story. If you watch Alfred Hitchcock's classic horror film Psycho, you'll see how he uses cameras all over the place. Psycho is actually a movie about this guy that runs a hotel, in case you haven't seen it. And sometimes he seems like a really nice guy, and sometimes he had these fits of psychosis where he thought he was his mom and he would kill people, and it was this big mess. But the thing about the movie was that everybody had a little bit of a psychosis. There wasn't any heroes in the movie. Everybody was good sometimes and bad other times. And so Hitchcock would film people split in half. I remember this one scene where the main actress in the film was sitting in her car and she was parked. I remember thinking how unusual it was that it was filmed in a way that there was a telephone pole right in the middle of her car. But it was all about the camera angle. Hitchcock intentionally positioned the camera so that the telephone pole would seem to split the car in two. It wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. And the camera angle was telling the story. That in the same way the car seemed to be split in two, so too does everyone's personalities seem to be split in two. Hence the psychosis. Now let's move along and actually talk about creating cameras in Max. So at this point, you might be asking yourself a really good question. Why do I even need cameras? When we're in the perspective viewport, we could hold the Alt and middle mouse button, as we've talked about, to rotate around. We could zoom in, zoom out. We could do all sorts of stuff, pan around. Why do we need to bring a camera into this? And that's a very good question. Let me tell you why you'd want to use a camera. Number one, you can't animate the perspective view. You can't zoom in and animate that. You can't pan around or rotate around something and animate that. And let's say, for example, you had a character that was making their big Oscar speech. You're going to want to be able to zoom into their face to really milk that emotional experience for all it's worth. You can't do that by using the perspective viewport. Also, when we use cameras, we have access to the size of the lens. For example, do we want a telephoto shot or a wide-angle shot? We'll talk about what those mean a little bit later, but again, that's not something you can do in the perspective viewport. And finally, there's a lot of cool tricks with cameras that we can do, like depth of field, which will create blur at certain distances of your camera viewing to make a certain object be the focus. Those are all pretty cool tricks, and you can't do them in the perspective view. Now, if you're just rendering out a still image and you don't want to affect the lens angle at all, well then, maybe the perspective viewport will work for you. Now, in the next segment, we're going to be talking about making cameras from scratch and moving them around. But in this segment, I'm going to show you a really cool shortcut, which is actually the way that I usually make cameras. I find it much easier. Let's go ahead and select a teapot over here in the Create tab. Make a few of those. Let's get a cool camera angle that we like. Or that I like, since I'm the one doing the video recording here. So, I like that one. Why not? Now, if we were to go now and try to create a camera, and we were going to try to match this, it could be a little tougher than what we just did. Just like with lights, some cameras have targets, and sometimes lining them up just right isn't quite as easy as using arc rotate in the perspective view. So, once we have the perspective viewport where we want it, so then what I can do is go to the Views menu and select Create Camera from View. However, I more often than not use this keyboard shortcut Control-C for Create Camera, if you like. I'm going to select that. Now, in our viewport, it seems that nothing has changed. But as you look in these other viewports, you'll notice that a camera has already been created for us. Notice also that our viewport is now called Camera 01 and not Perspective anymore. When you make a camera by default, Max usually switches out your perspective viewport with the new camera view that you've created. However, if I hit the letter P on the keyboard, I jump back to perspective view and I arc rotate around without any penalty, because as soon as I want to jump back to the camera view, I just hit the letter C to see what the camera is saying. And I haven't adjusted or fiddled with the camera in any way. So now let's move along and talk about the different types of cameras that are available to us. Okay, folks, this is going to be a quick little segment here just to talk about the two different types of cameras that we can create in Max. Under the Create tab of the command panel, let's go over to this little camera here and click on Cameras to select cameras. As you can see from this drop-down here, by default there's only standard cameras. And there's two object types, target and free. Now you probably have a good idea of what these mean if you went through the light chapter. When we create a target camera, as I click and drag here, it feels like you're creating a light. We click and drag, we have kind of a cone look here. If I right-click to select the Move Transform, we can click on the target and move that target around. Now let's put an object in the path of this camera here. There we go. So now it's looking at a teapot. And let's go ahead and hit the letter C in the perspective viewport to jump this to the camera view. And I can't quite see all that I need to of the camera, so I'm going to hit this tool and zoom out a little bit. And then we could use the pan tool to kind of bring that a little bit closer, and that works. We'll talk a little bit more about these navigational tools a little bit later on. For now, I'm going to select the Move Transform again, get back to selecting the camera target, and watch in the camera viewport as I move the camera target. You see that it moves around here. And I use the camera navigational tools that we'll talk about later to do this, but I could have just as easily gone here into the viewports and made the magic happen here as well. So I'm going to select this camera, not its target, the camera itself, and then hit delete. Go back to cameras, and let's make a free camera. Again, just as before, and again, just as with free lights, click once, and it automatically makes it for you. So as we hit the letter W to get access to the Move Transform, move that up. Now, selecting the perspective viewport, hit the letter C to change to the camera view, and there we go. We're seeing part of our teapot. In the top view, I can move that over. There we go. I could also rotate this around. And as you can see in the other viewports, my view is changing here. I could rotate it thusly. And that's about all you need to know for now about the two different types of cameras, target and free. To start this lesson, let's go to File, Open, get to our exercise files here. Chapter 13, open up buildings.max. This is a file we used a little bit earlier when we were talking about navigation. Now let's go ahead and zoom out a little bit. It's a little bit too much. Let's zoom in with the zoom tool, get a little bit more precise control over what's going on. That looks good. And once we're done, we could hit Control-C to again make a camera from our view. Now as you can see, it comes in automatically selected. It's white, and another way we can tell a camera is selected is if we look down at our navigation tools. If we select any other viewport, the navigation tools reset themselves back to their defaults. If we select the camera viewport, then these change to be navigation tools specific to cameras. And again, we're going to talk about those a little later on. So with the camera selected, let's go over to the Modify tab and see some of these properties here. If we scroll to the top, boy, there sure is a lot here. We're just going to spend time talking about this area here. And truth be told, this is actually one of the reasons I use cameras very frequently. Because we have the option with cameras to change the lens size. Now, if I change the lens size, you'll notice that the field of view changes as well. Just going to right-click to cancel that. Change the field of view, or FOV, and lens changes as well. They're intertwined. Now, as we increase the size of our lens, we'll actually make more of a telephoto shot. To see this better, let's go ahead and select our camera here. I'm going to right-click. And to select our camera, we could just click on our camera. Probably a better idea, though, is to click on this line in between the camera. And the reason why I want to do that is because you'll notice it now selected the camera and its target. If I click the camera only, I hit the W key to move it, the target you'll see stays the same. That's not what we want here. So I'm going to right-click to cancel that. Again, select the camera and the target by clicking the line in between them. And let's move this camera back out. Now you'll see that we've increased the size of our lens. And I'm going to pan around and select just the camera so we get back to our options here. But as we increase our lens, we decrease the field of view. This viewable area gets smaller. Telephoto lenses are used for seeing great distances. But another one of the side results that comes from that is that perspective is minimized. The distance between these objects seems smaller because we adjusted the camera angle so. So telephoto lenses like this are really good for looking at characters maybe on the other side of a lake or something. Now, if we take the lens down, we're actually increasing that camera angle. Look how much we're seeing here as we make this really huge. Now, 8mm is a really extreme example. Typically, you'd want to hover around the 35mm mark. That's pretty much the standard in camera lens angles. So in the top view, let's zoom this in a little closer. Actually, let me Click on that line to select both, the camera and the target. Move this in a little bit closer. And you'll see that now these buildings look like they're miles apart. So as we increase the FOV, we make a wide-angle lens, also sometimes called a fisheye lens if it's really extreme like this. And not only does using a fisheye lens like this exaggerate perspective, but also has like this really cool warping effect as objects get close to the camera. I'm going to select the camera only, and in the front viewport, I'm going to move it up. You'll see how these buildings, which have flat tops, are actually warped and distorted as they get closer to the camera. Now, we can adjust lens and FOV by using these sliders, but we can also select from these stock lenses here. I could jump to 35 quickly. You'll see that the top of those buildings just flatten out real quick there. Or we could jump to an extreme telephoto lens, or jump to an extreme wide-angle lens as well. Now, there's one other camera trick I want you to be aware of before we actually get into the navigation tools here, and that's depth of field. Don't get that confused with field of view. Field of view is basically this blue box, what the camera is able to see. Depth of field is a blur effect. But I don't want to steal my thunder because we're going to be talking about depth of field in the next segment, so let's go check it out. For this lesson, we're going to start with the depth of field file in the Chapter 13 folder. This is just a series of spheres here. I made one maroon to kind of break up the monotony. Let's select the camera viewport and hit F9 to render this. It's just a series of spheres here. Close this. And with the camera selected, let's go down to the camera options. Again, this is in the Modify tab here. Let's scroll down till we get to this area, Multi-Pass Effect. Now, if we go to this drop-down here, there are a few multi-pass effects to choose from. 2 different brands of depth of field, so to speak, and motion blur. We're not going to be talking about motion blur in this training series, but basically if you want motion blur applied to your scene, just select motion blur instead of depth of field. Motion blur is kind of a natural effect of real-world cameras. As objects move quickly, the camera just can't capture that information fast enough, and so there's usually little streaks. And these little streaks, when looked at frame by frame, tend to create blurs around an object that's in motion. If you have a character that's running, for example, if it doesn't have motion blur applied to it, it's going to look fake. And the reason it's going to look fake is because people's eyes are used to seeing this motion blur. And when they don't see it, it looks too real. It looks too clean. It's not believable. So remember, if you're animating something and you want to make it look realistic, add some motion blur. For now, we're going to stick to depth of field. And to turn this on, hit Enable. And this is what depth of field does. I'm going to hit F9 to render this. Very cool. Now, the spheres closest to the camera are still fine. They're still razor sharp. But as we start going out into further areas here, it gets a little blurry. This is depth of field. We can use depth of field to select which area we want the viewer's eyes to focus on. Our eyes naturally jump to this place because it's the most clean and sharp. Even though there's some maroon sphere in here, and so the monotony is broken up, when it's blurry, it essentially tells the viewer's eyes, hey, you know what? Don't worry about that stuff. It's not as important as this stuff that's not blurry up here in front. We can change the target distance, which will allow us, if we raise it up high enough, to keep these last areas in focus and blur everything ahead of it. Let's bump this up quite a bit and see the end result here. I'm going to hit F9 to render again. See, now these are crystal clear and these are blurry. Now I'm going to close this render window to show you something here. Notice as I change the target distance, I'm actually changing the target distance of the camera target. If I want to, I could uncheck Use Target Distance from the Depth of Field Parameters rollout, and this will use this focal depth instead. Now, using this slider won't affect the target distance on your camera. However, focal depth tends to blur the entire scene. So I'm going to check Use Target Distance. Now, a couple things you need to be aware of here. As you might have noticed when we selected Depth of Field, it was in an area called Multi-Pass Effects. And also you might have noticed that when you're rendering, it seemed to go in spurts. It didn't just render in one straight image like it usually does. It kind of rendered a little bit, then rendered again, and rendered again, until it finally kept building on itself and we had a complete image. Well, each time it renders a little piece there, that's referred to as a pass. Now, passes add significantly to render time, but they also increase the quality. Again, that trade-off. So we can increase the total passes here or decrease them if we want to. And finally, I want you to be aware that sample radius essentially increases the size of the blur. So taking this up will make the stuff that's blurry even more so. So there's a few other bells and whistles here to play with, but I think you get the idea. And personally, I prefer to do my depth of field work in a compositing program. My compositing program of choice is Adobe After Effects, but there's Combustion and a whole list of others to use. But if you wanted to do it right here in Max and not add that extra step at the end, this is how you do it. In this segment, we're going to talk about how to get the camera to see what you want it to see. That's the frustrating part about cameras, is sometimes they behave in a way that you don't want them to. Knowing the camera navigational tools, though, can really make that process a whole lot easier. So let's go ahead and create a new camera, target camera in the front view. Click and drag. Beautiful. Now let's select the perspective view and hit the letter C so that we're seeing what the camera sees. Again, notice if I select the front view, these camera navigational tools will go away. So again, select the camera view. Now we have here this dolly camera button, which basically as we zoom in and out here, we just basically zoom into our scene. I'm going to right click to cancel out of that so we get back to square one. There's actually 3 different dolly tools, and I'm going to show you what those 3 tools are in just a second. But I want you to be aware of a concept that we're going to see over and over again with these navigational tools. And that is that there are tools that seem very similar to each other, and at first it may seem hard to tell them apart, but usually one will move a target, and then another one will move the camera, and then sometimes there's another one, a third one, that will move both. And that's the case here with the dolly tools. Now to see the difference, I want you to watch this little info area here. So as I go to select these tools by holding the left mouse button down, as I put my mouse over this one, you'll see that the info area on the left says I'm going to dolly the camera. So as I zoom in, the target stays the same, but the camera moves in and out. This is a good way to zoom in for a cool shot. Going back to our list here, we could also just dolly the target, as you can see from the info area. So clicking that tool and zooming in and out, we see that the target just moves. Now I could also select the field of view tool here and zoom in and zoom out. But I'm doing more than just zooming in and zooming out. Actually, I'm not even zooming in or zooming out at all. I'm changing the field of view. If we go over to the Modify tab and scroll up so we can see the field of view for our camera, as we use this tool, you notice that it changes. And notice as I change the field of view that the target stays the same here. I can select on the Perspective tool, and in the camera view, click it, and with the mouse button held down, go up and down. We'll see that a similar thing is happening, except this time the camera is moving as well. With this tool, also notice that the target is stationary also. Now, if we want to move our camera around instead of just in and out, we could orbit the camera. But just as orbit implies, it's rotating around an object. All over the place around an object, wherever we want. I'm going to right click to cancel that. Underneath the Orbit tool is the Pan tool. And the Pan tool keeps the camera stationary, but moves the target. Right-click to cancel out of that. The Truck tool, which looks like a hand, actually moves both. So it kind of looks a little stiff in the viewports, but if you're just trying to move everything up or move everything down, the Truck tool is a great resource for that. And finally, there is this roll camera, which basically rotates the camera along its own axis. So if you want to make things kind of spinning and going dizzy, the roll camera tool might help you. Right-click to cancel that. I'm actually going to delete this camera and make a new one. And I want to show you one final trick here. I find that when I animate cameras, which by the way, you could use any of those tools to animate cameras in the same way that you animate anything else. But I find that when I'm moving it around, it's not a very organic process. It just doesn't feel right sometimes. So what I do when I animate my camera is I actually cheat a little bit. But I find that cheating process really helps me to have better control over my camera. Now, you may not want to use this workflow, and that's fine. I'm including it here just as a little tip. So in the front view, I'm going to make a camera, and I want to point the camera center point, or the target of the camera, to be at the middle of the graph. And it looks like in every viewport that's the case, so I'm going to let go. And now what I'm going to do is move over down the road one here to helpers. Helpers are usually non-rendering objects we put in our scene to help us do a bunch of stuff. They can help us control other objects. that could help us measure, that type of thing. So I'm going to create what is actually a pretty popular helper object, a dummy. And in the front view, I'm just going to click and drag here. And this is a non-rendering little box. Again, it's going to help us control our camera. Now let's move it into place so it's exactly where our camera is. In all viewports here. Now again, there's nothing special about this dummy. It's just a box that doesn't render. If you're familiar with Adobe After Effects, it's akin to the null object there. And the reason why I'm using this dummy object, this box, to control my camera is because it doesn't have a target and all these other options to deal with. So the next thing we need to do is change the pivot point of the dummy to be the target of the camera, to be in the same place as the target of the camera. So I'm going to go to the Hierarchy tab, select Effect Pivot Only, and in the front view I'm going to move this into place here, making sure it lines up in all viewports so that the pivot point of the dummy is in the exact same spot as the target of the camera. Once you're done with that, hit the Effect Pivot Only button to turn that off. Now we're ready to link these together. We do so using the standard parent-child relationship. Now, to make sure I do this right, I'm going to zoom in on the top view here. And remember, when linking objects, we always start with the child and then assign the parent. So let's select the linking tool, click on the camera, and drag to the parent, the dummy object. Now, if I zoom out here, and I want to rotate around, then I get this effect. And actually, that's the wrong ring here. Let's go out one more ring. And actually, that's not working because I have the camera selected. So let me right-click to cancel out of this. Let's select the dummy. And notice when I select the dummy, the gizmo goes around its pivot point, which is the same place as the camera's target. Let's go ahead and animate this. I'm going to hit the letter N, and let's move along in time. And then let's rotate this. There we go. Actually, maybe let's move it over to the other side. I think that'll look cooler. And let's change the perspective view to the camera view by hitting the letter C. And let's hit home and the question mark to preview. There we go. I'm going to hit the N to get out of auto key mode. Now, it's not actually prerequisite to use a dummy, but I like the control that it gives me. I feel like I have more power over my camera as I'm moving it around. Watch in the top view as I rotate my dummy object and my camera comes along for the ride. It just feels a lot more organic doing it this way. But again, you could use the navigational tools if you wish, or you could use the advanced animation controllers, which we'll hit on towards the end of this training series. Rendering, like lighting, is another one of those topics that amateurs often breeze right over. But the more skilled I get in 3ds Max, the more time I spend learning about rendering. Rendering, in a nutshell, is really just taking your creations in Max and making them pixels, either making a movie or a still image usually. But the method or methods that Max uses to create those pixels varies wildly. As you've seen, it's very easy to create an initial basic render by just hitting the F9 key. But as you can imagine, it gets significantly more powerful. To demonstrate this, let's open up the exercise files folder and then chapter 14. We have here two renders, a low quality render, which is basically akin to the renders that we've been doing so far, and an HQ, a high quality render. First of all, let's double click that low quality render to open that up. Now we have some basic lights in this scene. This scene, by the way, is in the advanced lighting folder that ships in the samples folder with Max. Now we're getting some really cool shadows over here, some interesting stuff going on with the lighting on top of this statue's head and whatnot, but still it's not very realistic. And I'll tell you why it's not very realistic. As we look at the floor, it's lit pretty nicely. But as we look at the wall, there's no light bouncing off from the floor to the wall. And in real life, light bounces. Look around right now in the room in which you're sitting. There are probably areas somewhere in the room where light is not directly hitting, but you can still tell what's going on there because light is bouncing off from other places into that area. So, using the same lights that we have in this scene, we could tell our rendering engine, in other words, the means by which we make our scene into pixels, we tell our rendering engine, hey, you know what? When light rays come out of light, bounce them around like it does in the real world. Doing so, as I close this, will yield in a much more realistic result. Let's double click HQ render to see how this looks. Wow. Folks, this is the exact same file, the exact same camera angle, and even the exact same lighting setup. The only difference between this and the low quality render we just saw is the render settings that we're using. Again, let's go back to the old, and now let's look at the high quality. Looks absolutely beautiful. And we could probably spend a lot of time looking at this image and analyzing it and seeing how light is bouncing around. But suffice it to say, it looks significantly better. And again, the power of the realism has to do with the lighting setup and our render settings. So let's get talking about those render settings. Now, before we get into render settings, I want to make something to render. So I'll probably just make a teapot in the top view here. You can make whatever, it really doesn't matter. Hit Z to zoom extents. Now we're going to get into the render scene dialog box. That's basically where we change our render settings. We can do that the hard way by going to the toolbar and scrolling. Even farther beyond the material editor is this render scene dialog button. I don't think I've ever pushed that button in my entire life. I always use the keyboard shortcut F10. Now I realize that F10 might be a little hard to remember, but folks, you use this dialog box all the time. Maybe get a tattoo on the back of your hand if you need to, but remember this shortcut. Now there is obviously a lot here. And for this segment, we're just going to skim over the Common tab. These are the features and functions that you will be using the most. Probably most important is time output. By default, it's set to single. So that way, when we hit F9, we render just a still image. However, if we were to select active time element, it would attempt to render the entire timeline. You could render pieces of the timeline by selecting a range. Let's say I want frames 75 to 100. Hit enter there, or just hit some other field, and it will only render 75 to 100. You could also render every nth frame, so maybe every fifth frame you want to render. So you just maybe want a basic idea of what it looks like. Down here under output size, there's some standards here. If you're doing television in North America, you'll probably want to use one of the NTSC standards. If you're doing television in Europe, most likely you'll want to use one of the PAL or PAL standards. There's also an HDTV standard, some slide standards, and also some film presets as well. I'm going to click out of here, select custom. There's also some standard sizes here. Just hit a button and you'll see that my width and height automatically update to reflect the button that I've just selected. Of course, you can change that manually. Go over here with the spinner and adjust that. What's really cool too is that you could lock down the image aspect ratio, and then as you move your width, your height will adjust accordingly so that the width and height of your render stay proportionate. Now, it's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, but it's good to know that pixels on your monitor have a square aspect ratio, means they're as wide as they are tall. Pixels on a television set do not have square pixels. Now, again, this is a little bit more sophisticated than we have time to discuss here fully, but suffice it to say, there's a couple standards here, and I'll give you these numbers and you could write them down. Pixel aspect ratio of 1 is good for on-screen display. If you're doing something for the web or something else that will be viewed on a computer monitor, leave that set to 1. If you're doing standard full-screen television, change that to 0.9. If you're doing widescreen television stuff, change that to 1.2. Let's scroll down here a little bit. Now this render output area is extremely important. If you want to save your file and have the most control over its output, you want to hit this Files button. Select Files, and I could name this whatever I would like to. And then it says Save as Type. Well, here are the formats you can save to from 3ds Max. You could save to AVI, you could save to still image formats, QuickTime movies, etc., etc., etc. Now, one thing you need to be aware of is that a lot of newbies instantly go and render to video. Now, some of the most expert users in the world do the same thing. But sometimes, actually very often, you might want to render to a series of images called a sequence. The standard for that in the 3D world is Targa. More often than not, when I output from 3ds Max, I'm outputting a series of Targa files, or a Targa sequence. So a question you might ask is, well, if you're rendering animation, why would you want to do a series of still images? Well, when we're dealing with really robust scenes, maybe you have fire spewing out of a dragon who's wagging his tail and doing all sorts of crazy stuff. And Max is actually a pretty unstable program. We've talked about saving in increments and about how Max files often get corrupted. And, poor Max, it has a lot to do. And oftentimes when it's rendering, it will crash. So if you're rendering out a movie, and let's say it takes you 100 hours to render out that movie segment, if it crashes, in the 99th hour, you've lost 99 hours of work. If in that same project you would have rendered to a series of still images, then the only thing that you would have to re-render is that one image file that it crashed on. Another cool thing about Targa files is that they can contain transparency, or an alpha channel in other words. But it's a little hidden how to get it to do that. I'm going to select the Targa image file, and I want to select something for the name. Doesn't matter, I'm not going to really save this. Hit save. It doesn't actually save anything yet. We get to the Targa image control dialog box. Now, mine automatically said 32. Yours might say 24. This refers to the total bit depth of the image. If you want it to have an alpha channel, you need to save it as a 32-bit image. And then we can hit OK. And then once we render, it will render our movie file if we have a movie here. Also be aware, and this is kind of frustrating sometimes, that the viewport selected here at the bottom of the render scene dialog is the one that will get rendered. If you have a really sweet camera and it's all moving around, you might be very disappointed that your final render is rendered from the top view. So make sure that you change this to select the viewport that you want to render. If you're worried about making the mistake that I just mentioned and accidentally rendering the wrong view, you can hit this padlock. You see, typically, as you click on different views to select them, you'll notice that the viewport name changes here. So if I were to open this render scene dialog box or render with the front view selected, it's going to automatically assume that that's the view that I want to render. If we select the viewport we really want it to render and then just lock it down, then no matter which viewport we select, it will not be changed here. Kind of a good way to dummy proof it. Now another thing that's important is this rendered frame window. Basically, when we hit F9 and bring up a render here, it brings up this rendered frame window. Well, if you're doing a production quality render, maybe you're rendering an animation or something, it's actually going to slow down your render considerably to have to visually show you what it's doing as it renders. So as I'm playing around in Max, I always have this checked, but as I'm ready to do my final render, I always have it unchecked. And that's the essentials of the scan line rendering controls. And you might ask, well, what does scan line mean? Well, if we go into the assign renderer area here, we select what our rendering engine is right here. As we click this dialog box, we'll see that we also have the opportunity to select the mental ray renderer or the view file renderer. We'll be talking about the mental ray renderer a little bit later, but the name of the default rendering engine in 3ds Max is the scanline renderer. And now you know the basics, so good for you. Now let's move along and talk about the rendering environment, another really crucial element in rendering. I'm going to continue here where I left off in the last segment, the very simple scene with just a basic teapot in it. Now let's talk about the rendering environment. We get there by accessing the rendering menu at the top and selecting environment, or we could just hit the 8 key on the main area of the keyboard. Now there's a lot of powerful stuff here, but I just want to give you a heads up about a few important things. First of all, as we hit F9 to render, you'll notice we have by default a black background. But a lot of times you might not want a black background. Sometimes having a lot of black in your scene masks problems, and especially if you're going to do compositing work later, meaning you're going to stack renders on top of each other, you don't want a bunch of little hidden problems in your scene. You want to be able to see everything that you're doing. So we could change the color here to maybe white or blue or whatever. I hit close, and now if I render it, just so we have that blue background. And you see now a little bit more clearly, for example, the problems created with normals. Now we know that the other side of this teapot is not hollow, but because of the normals that we're seeing, the back side of the other side of the teapot, it's creating this transparency. We can see right through it, as you can see the spout here through this little crack. So if we were going to render this teapot with an alpha channel, meaning a file that would remember its transparency information, and then we tried to layer it on top of or composite these teapots somewhere else, say for example in the middle of the sky with clouds or whatever, we would see that sky and clouds background through these cracks. So not using a black background is a good warning sign for things like this. I'm just going to hit close. We could also use an environment map. If we hit none, just as in the material editor, hitting that none button will take us to the material map browser. From here we can click a bitmap to load a bitmap in as our background, or a map or what have you. Now if I render it, I have a cellular map. And that's extremely creepy for some reason. I'm going to close that out as soon as possible. If you don't want to use the map anymore, all I have to do is uncheck Use Map, or I can get this dialog box back and simply say None. Now, I'm going to take the color back to black. Again, you can tell you have black by 000. That's pure black. I'm going to close this. And we could also bump up the ambient light. This is good for modeling and other purposes where you just need a flood of light temporarily, but you never want to render with this. I'm going to click this and bump up the light amount to about there. You can already see the change in our viewport here. This is starting to look cartoony already. Hit close and F9 to render. Now we don't see too much of a difference just yet, but if I close this and then hit the letter M for the material editor, we'll see that, well, our materials really have changed quite a bit, haven't they? If I unlock these and then apply basic material to this, let's make the diffuse color something like dark red, and the ambient color something like a little bit darker red. Hit close. And now if we render, you see that we're not getting pure black in our image. There's just too much ambient light. This is definitely not what you want for rendering purposes. And I can tell you generally as a rule from photo editing that you want your blacks to be black and your whites to be white. You want your shadows to remain shadow colors and your highlights to remain highlight colors. And right now, our shadows are being washed out. We don't want that. And so a lot of newbies will try to fake good lighting by cranking up their ambient slider. You don't want to do that. It looks very amateurish. Now, I mentioned earlier that we can add an image to the background. This is also a very standard workflow for people that are new to 3ds Max. But typically in a more professional workflow, you want to render with nothing back there and then composite the background later in After Effects. That gives you the most flexibility. Let's say you have a render of a guy walking in the park. So you have a park image in the background, and then the dude walks by, and that's your render. Well, if you decide later that you want to swap out the background for a beach background, you're pretty much stuck. You have to go back to Max and re-render. If you render the guy alone with an alpha channel, and then in the compositing program, composite the dude on top of the park or wherever, then you have the flexibility later on to swap it out without having to go back to Max and re-render. But that's just the way I like to work. Now let's talk a little bit more about how to render selectively. Now before we get into Metal Ray, I want to give you some quick rendering production tips to help speed things along as you're trying to render your projects. To do this, I'm going to create some spheres in the top view. Sphere, 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 sphere. Now I mentioned that F9 gives you a quick render, and it does. But there's a little viewport trick here. When you hit F9, it renders the viewport you initially select. But then every time you render thereafter, it's going to render that same viewport that you initially rendered. So if I now hit F9 with the top viewport selected, it will render the top viewport. I'm going to close this now. Now let's select the front viewport and again hit F9. Well, that doesn't look like the front viewport. And most certainly it is not. It is the top view. So that's why before we rendered everything so far in the training series, I always say select the perspective viewport and then render, because that's usually the one that we look at when we're rendering. At least that's what we've been using so far in this training series. Now, if you ever want to override that, I'm going to close this here. And let's say we do want to render the front view. I could hit the Shift key and the letter Q at the same time. So Shift Q will override that. And as you can see now from here in the image window, we've rendered the front viewport. Let's close this out. Now, if we go all the way to the right-hand side of the main toolbar, we'll see this view drop down. And this tells us what we're going to render. By default, it's set to view, meaning that you select a view, front, top, perspective, or whatever, and it renders that view. But there are a couple other options here that I want you to be aware of, and there are a whole load that you can choose from. But let's say, for example, you have a big, complicated scene, and you don't want to take time to hide all the objects every time you want to render a certain model. Well, you could click on Selected from this rendering type dropdown, and then when you render, let's hit F9, only that object will be rendered. Now, what you're seeing here is a complete render, or so it looks, but in reality, other than the currently selected sphere, all these other spheres are just left over from the last render. So it actually only rendered the selected sphere. Let's close this image window, maybe get a more visual example. So I'm going to select this pink sphere here. I'm going to right click to get out of sphere creation mode. Then select the pink sphere. And let's hit Shift Q to render just that pink sphere. You see that? I just get that pink sphere. And again, this other junk behind it is still left over from the background from last time. Close this. And if I were to select, for example, let's arc rotate and select this green one. So that's the new selected one. And then we hit Shift Q again. You see it only rendered that one sphere and left the other stuff we already had as kind of a wallpaper. Now I'm going to close this. There's actually another render type that's pretty cool as well. underneath selected, we have region. So if I were now to, let's zoom around here so we can see multiple spheres. And let's say we hit Shift Q. Instead of rendering the viewport, we get this little box here. What this is telling us is we get to select what region we want to render. Let's say we want to render just this little area. Once we're done, resizing that box to what we want to render, hit OK, and only that little part will be rendered. Again, on top of all the junk that was already there, but still a nice way to just render part of your scene. Okay, enough little shortcuts. Let's get on to talk about the big beefy power of Mental Ray. This segment is going to be a whirlwind tour through the Mental Ray rendering engine. Now, Mental Ray will add some time to your render, and depending on the materials and lighting setup that you have, it could add a whole heck of a lot of time to your render. But if set up appropriately, that time will be worth it. The Mental Ray rendering engine is of a significantly higher quality than is the default scanline rendering engine. And folks, to make a little bit of a confession here, I'm honestly still trying to learn all the ins and outs of Mental Ray myself. I've taken classes, watched movies, read books, all on the Mental Ray rendering engine. And I've been using it to render for production for years. But there's so much to it that I still feel like a baby. So we're just going to have a brief overview here, and hopefully that'll spark some interest in you, and you'll go in and learn a little bit more about it and start using Mental Ray for your projects. First of all, we need to change our rendering engine to Mental Ray. So I'm going to hit F10 to get our render scene dialog box. Right here at the top, it's saying default scanline renderer. We don't want that. So let's scroll down. Under assign renderer, under production here, we get this little choose renderer ... icon. Click on that button, double click on Mental Ray renderer, and things look somewhat similar. But a few of these tabs have changed. Indirect illumination is probably the most important one. Indirect illumination is where a lot of the magic happens inside of Mental Ray. Now with 3ds Max 9, Autodesk has introduced Mental Ray 3.5. These used to be two separate applications, and now Mental Ray is included with 3ds Max. Hence, it has a different version number than Max does. But it's here under the Indirect Illumination tab that we find a lot of the power inside of Mental Ray. We can enable Final Gather, which deals with the bouncing of light, which, if done correctly, can add a lot of photorealism to your scene. Now, new to 3ds Max 9, because it's new to Mental Ray 3.5, are these custom render presets. It used to be a science in and of itself to understand all this Final Gather stuff, as well as global illumination. If you scroll down here, you'll find that there. These kind of work hand in hand to produce really high quality results. Using Mental Ray, we could also create caustics. Caustics are those little lightning looking things when you go to see a swimming pool, for example, say an indoor pool especially, and you'll see these little waves of light that remind me of lightning bolts for some reason, although they don't really look like lightning bolts, I guess. But on the side of the wall of an indoor pool, you'll see these waves of white light. Those little waves of white light are caustics, reflections from the pool. And Mental Ray has a whole little system here for handling those. I'm going to turn off Final Gather for right now. Another area that Mental Ray comes in really handy is in materials. Once you have the Mental Ray renderer selected, again, this will not work if you have the scanline renderer selected, you could hit M to get the material editor, change the material type, and we will have all of these yellow materials. Again, this doesn't work if you have the scanline renderer selected. All these yellow materials are Mental Ray materials. New inside Mental Ray 3.5 and 3ds Max 9 are this Arc and Design material and this car paint material. Another thing from my experience that Mental Ray handles really well is something called subsurface scattering. You'll see this SSS in some of these materials. Basically what that is a way to describe a phenomenon. Actually, you see it all the time in real life, where there's two layers kind of on top of each other. We saw this a little bit earlier when we were looking at materials, and we talked about the shellac material. You see you have that one base layer of the paint, and then you have the shellac layer on top. And they kind of interact in some really advanced ways. Well, that's an example of subsurface scattering. Skin is another one. Skin on CG characters, especially as of a few years ago, was of a very low quality. Just putting a peach-type color on Caucasian skin is not very believable. If you look at your skin, there's actually a lot happening right below the surface. And so this subsurface scattering stuff, try to say that 10 times fast, that stuff really helps when we're trying to do material like that, like skin, maybe like the top of a candle. Anytime where there's a surface and then there's something happening right below the surface that's very interesting as well. Now, one other thing I want to point out, if I close the material browser here and select the perspective viewport and hit F9 to render as usual, do you see those little lines that just popped up there? Mental Ray renders a little bit different than the scanline renderer. The scanline renderer just has a little scanline. Mental Ray has these little squares that pop up to kind of unveil the image as it's rendering. Those little squares are called buckets. And so you have this little bucket that kind of goes around your image rendering it. And the reason I bring that up is because if you have a dual processor machine, then there will be two buckets. So your rendering will be sped up significantly with Mental Ray. So I know this was just a teaser for Mental Ray, but I just wanted to open the door for you so that you know what's here. Mental Ray is an extremely powerful rendering engine. And 99% of the time, when I see an amazing render from 3ds Max, it was rendered using Mental Ray. Okay, folks, as we're getting ready to say goodbye and wind this training series to an end, I want to give you a little smattering, a sample of some really advanced, super sick stuff available in 3ds Max. This entire chapter is just going to be very brief overviews. Now, again, these are advanced topics, as if some of the stuff we haven't covered already was pretty advanced. Almost every single one of the videos in this chapter could probably have its own entire training series devoted just to that one topic. And so to start out this chapter, we're going to be talking about video post. Video post is kind of like a built-in compositing application, like a mini After Effects or a mini combustion. We could play with color a little bit. We could add some special effects, some lens flares. We could even do compositing inside video post as well. And for this demonstration, and for several others throughout this chapter, we're going to be using our old buddy Herbie. You'll find him in the robot.max file inside your chapter 15 folder. Herbie's been with us for a long time, and it's finally time to give him his due. Let him have a day in the sun. So we're going to make him look pretty. If I hit F9 to render this, we'll see we have some basic lighting applied to Herbie, including an Omni light behind him and a spotlight facing him. So let's close this. Now let's open up Video Post. Go to the rendering menu at the top and select Video Post. This is why Max is so intimidating to so many people. If we go to the rendering menu, Video Post just seems like a tiny little option in one of the many menus in Max, and yet it's this huge sub-application inside of Max. It seems like the more I use this amazing program, the more I stumble on huge areas of the program I missed before. It's amazing. So the first thing we want to do to use Video Post is add a scene event. Let's hit this button. And Video Post uses viewports. So I'm going to select Camera 01 and hit OK. Next, let's select that scene event and add an image filter event. These are special effects. If you look at this drop-down, we have a whole bunch of cool stuff to choose from, even star fields, created right from scratch from 3ds Max 9. For this example, however, I'm going to select Lens Effects Flare and hit OK. Now let's go select Lens Effects Flare one more time. And in this dialog box, let's hit the Setup button. Now we're getting to the cool stuff, folks. Now I'm going to hit VPQ for Video Post Q, and let's hit Preview. And there's Herbie. Now what I'm going to do is select Node Sources. We have this lens flare, which is basically a really cool light effect. So I want to attach this to a light. I'm going to hit Node Sources, double-click on Omni 01. I can't really see anything yet, so let's bump up the size of this effect. Oh, now it's getting cool. Put that up a little bit more. I like it. Now we can go and bump up the intensity of this effect if we wanted to. Or bump it down, excuse me. There's all sorts of parameters we can fiddle with. Even the various parts, the glow of it, the ring of it, the rays, the streak, for example. If I take sharp down to maybe 4 or so, then these little streaks aren't quite as sharp. So we could keep playing with those. I mean, this is just amazing. It's so fun to get in Video Post and just play with all these effects and whatnot. For now, I'm just going to hit OK. And once we're ready to render, we can hit this little guy here, Execute Sequence. I'm just going to output a single frame. I'm going to select Render. And if I were to render this from the regular perspective view or from a camera viewport right now, it wouldn't work. To get these effects, you need to render them from Video Post. And you'll notice that there are two passes. You have the initial render pass, and then you have the effects pass at the end. So there's a lot to play here, especially if you're not familiar with any applications to do compositing in, like Combustion or After Effects. Video Post is a really amazing tool. Ooh boy, folks, this is where it gets really, really exciting. This is why I'm into motion graphics and animation. I love particles and explosions and all that super nerdy stuff. And that's exactly what we're going to be showing you in this segment. I've opened up Herbie Particles from chapter 15 of the exercise files. Now let's just jump right in and make some particles. Here's how easy it is to create particle systems. Now, if we go to the standard geometry area, and under standard primitives, we select particle systems, you'll see that we have snow, spray, blizzard, and a lot of these may or may not sound all that great to you. How often do you need to make snow? Well, it's all about the creativity here, folks. As you'll see, even with something just like snow, your creativity and the materials you apply to your particles, yes, I said the materials you apply to your particles, make all the difference in the world. Let's start out by making some basic snow. I'm just going to select the snow particle system. And in the top view, I'm going to draw a little box here. And that has created our snow particles. I'm going to hit the letter W, move this up in the front view. Now we're seeing snow because our time slider is at frame 61. If we go back to the first frame by hitting the home key, we'll see that there's no snow. This is really cool because it auto animates. As I hit the question mark to preview, you'll see in the front view that our snow automatically falls. We didn't have to do anything to it. One of the cool things about particle systems, we don't have to animate the particles. That's why we use them. So for stuff like smoke and fire and water, stuff where there's going to be a lot of the same thing, that's when we would use a particle system. And we don't control the particles, we control the system that controls the particles. So I'm going to move this down a little bit more so we can see it in our camera view. Now, if we render the camera view, I'm just going to hit Shift Q to do that. So it doesn't really look like snow very much. We have these geometric shapes that aren't that cool. There's only a few of them. So let's close this and go over to the Modify tab, making sure that our particle system is selected. And first thing I want to do is I want to bump up life. If we go down to this timing area, we have life, which is basically how soon our particles die out. So how long they live. So this means that they're going to last for 30 frames. So they die out pretty quickly, and so the snow is dead by the time it hits his hands. That's not cool. I want more snow than that, so let's bump up that life-o-meter. And now the snow will last a little bit longer. Very cool. Let's go up a little bit here. Now here we could change the render count. So as I bump this up, we're not going to see anything else in the viewport, because that's the viewport count. We're actually changing the render count. So if I hit F9 now, we'll see a few more of these. And they're a little bit smaller to make room for the others. And I could bump up the flake size to compensate for that if I wanted to. And because we're not animating the individual particles, we're animating the system, we could also control speed and tumble. Usually we'd have to do that manually, but if we use a particle system, we don't have to. Now let's get rid of this ugly shape thing that we got going on. In the render area, I'm going to select facing. This is very important. And I'm going to hit the letter M to get the material editor. The second material over here is called Snow Map. So let's apply this material to our selection. Again, this is just a brief overview, folks. If you want to get into what I did here, then it's all in the exercise files. Feel free to open this up and see how I made these. I have an opacity map here, for example, and take this apart. Again, this is just a brief little tour here. So apply this material to our particle system and now render it and see what it looks like. Oh, much more believable snow. But now that we have a material on this, those particles look a little too big. So let's go back to flake size, maybe take that down to 1, and then render. Hey, it's beginning to look a lot like Herbie's in snow. So let's go ahead and close that. And I'm going to delete this snow system and go back to the Create tab and make a new one. Close the material editor for now. Let's make a new one here. But this time I'm going to hit the letter E so I can rotate this in the front view 180 degrees so that these particles are actually coming up. Well, that's interesting. Let's go to the Modify tab and let's take the flake size to 8 or somewhere thereabouts. Let's take the render count to 600. Make this facing. Take up the life amount quite a bit. What we're going to do, actually I'm going to move this up a little bit more. And we're actually going to put Herbie in the middle of his own heavy metal tribute show. So let's go ahead and hit M to get the material editor. And over here we have sparks. So let's go ahead and add this sparks material. Again, this is the same snow particle system we dealt with to make snow, but we're using it for unnatural purposes. Let's go ahead and assign this material to this selection and select the perspective viewport and render. Oh, yeah, that's the stuff dreams are made of. That is sweet. Folks, I could play with sparks all day. I love sparks and flames and fire and all that stuff. Oh, what a joy. We could obviously make this look way cooler, but this is definitely an awesome start. I'm going to close this, close the material editor, and delete that system. And before we leave this segment of extremely fun things, let me show you one final other one. I'm going to go to the Create tab, and I'm going to go to Helpers, actually. Now, before we talked about all the boring little helper stuff that's here, and I shouldn't minimize it because it actually is very helpful. It's just not super exciting. But under this standard drop-down, we can select Atmospheric Apparatus. Select Sphere Gizmo. Make a sphere about that big. That's pretty cool. Oh, I'm so excited for this. Go to the rendering menu and go back to environment where we were when we set up a background image or whatever, the ambient light, that sort of thing. And what we're going to do is we're going to add an atmosphere. So we could go under here under atmosphere, click add, select an effect. If we had time, these volume fog and volume light ones are super sweet. But for now, let's go ahead and select the fire effect. We are making a heavy metal tribute after all. So let's scroll down a little bit. Now what we need to do is pick the gizmo. So we have the effect, but now we need to tell 3ds Max where to apply the effect. We do that by picking the atmospheric apparatus that we just created. So select Pick Gizmo, come over here to the camera viewport, click on the gizmo, and render and be really happy. Oh, that is awesome. Tell you what, let's go ahead and close this. Move this up in the front view. And actually, I'm going to hit R for the scale tool and scale this up a little bit. And change the flame type from fireball to tendril. Let's try rendering that one more time. Oh, that is just cool. That is so awesome. A robot in a ball of fire. Ladies and gentlemen, do you now see why I mentioned at the beginning of this that this is going to be one of the best training titles you've ever sat through? Where else are you going to see a robot on fire? Dang, that's cool. Reactor is another one of those little programs included in Max. We use Reactor to recreate dynamic simulations. See, for example, we had a handful of ping pong balls, and we wanted to dump them down a flight of stairs. Well, animating every single ping pong ball to bounce, and to bounce off the wall, to bounce off other ping pong balls, that would be just a headache. And so Reactor is like a simulation system. We just set up some parameters, and Reactor does all the work for us. In this example, I'm just going to make a little cylinder roll down a wooden plank. Something we could keyframe, but I don't want to take the time to do that. So I'm going to create a cylinder in the front view, actually. A little tube here. Looks good. I'm going to hit Z to zoom extents. Zoom out in the front view. Let's make a box. And we can just go ahead and make that in the front view as well. Make sure these are not touching. And I'm going to hit Control-A to select all, and then zoom extents for both of these. And actually, let's go modify that box just a little bit. So a little bit wider and a little bit higher. So what we're going to do is we're going to have this little cylinder fall down onto this wooden plank and then roll off of it. And we are not going to keyframe anything. So the first thing we need to do is select both of these objects and add them to a Reactor rigid body collection. Go up to the main area of the toolbar, right-click on the toolbar, and let's get access to the Reactor toolbar. Now we're going to be using this often, so let's drag this up and let's make this part of our interface here. There we go. Now this is the rigid body collection button. In order for Reactor to be able to create this simulation, all of the objects involved need to be part of this collection. So let's create a collection here. Instantly we'll have this little gizmo here. This really doesn't do anything, but it's an icon that's kind of helpful. If we need to add other objects to this simulation, then we can click this button to get its properties. From here we can add other objects or delete objects that are already in our collection. We're about ready to go, but I'm going to give these objects some properties first. First, let's select the box. And we're going to go to the property editor here. And under simulation geometry, I'm going to select concave mesh. And for the cylinder, I'm going to go to the property editor. I'm going to leave simulation geometry at mesh convex hull. I'm going to take the mass up to about, 65 or so, and close this. And that's it now. We're ready to go. Now, the simulation usually uses the perspective viewport. So let's make sure that the perspective viewport is all pretty the way we want it so we can see our animation when it happens. Looks good. Now, if I preview this using the question mark, nothing happens. It's because the animation happens in Reactor, not necessarily in Max. So let's go over here to this button, which is Preview Animation, and we'll get a very interesting little window here. And so as it says here, push P to play. Let's see how this works. Cylinder falls, rolls, and then once it gets to the end, just falls off the edge there. Very nice. You could also, while we're in this little window here, actually move this around. As you can see here, this is the Reactor real-time preview using OpenGL window. So this is going to be dynamic. So I'm going to close this window here, close this info box as well. Now let's say I love that animation. What I can do is come here to this button, Create Animation. This will take my Reactor simulation and convert it to 3ds Max keyframes. Hit this button, it's going to say, hey, you know what? This can't be undone. Are you sure you want to do it? Yes, I'm sure. I'm going to hit OK. Give it just a minute. And now, when we preview this inside the Max window, we'll see our little preview here. There's our cylinder, it falls, and then it drops off the face of the Earth. Actually, it would have, but we didn't make our timeline long enough for that to happen. Now, using Reactor, we could simulate springs and cloth and all sorts of stuff. It's really a powerful system. And what's really cool about 3ds Max 9 is that in this new version, the help for Reactor has now been integrated into the regular help for the entire application. So all you have to do is hit that good old F1 key or go to Help User Reference to access Reactor help as well as the 3ds Max help. Animation controllers are little restraints in Max that put limits to our animation. As the name implies, they control the animation. Let's create a teapot in the top view. And I'm also going to create a line in the top view. Any squiggly old line will work. Right-click once you're done. Hit the W key to move this up a little bit in the front view. And actually, I'm going to rotate this also in the front view along this axis. Oh, this is going to be cool. Okay, now let's create a camera. Let's create a target camera in the front view. Click and drag down. Very good. And the perspective view, let's hit the letter C to make this view the camera view. Now, with the camera selected, let's go to the Motion tab. And what we're going to do is change the basic controller for the position of the camera. We do that by hitting this button. And look at all the different types of controllers. There's certainly a lot of fun stuff here. For right now, I'm just going to select Path Constraint to show you one example of what's possible with these animation controllers. I'm going to select Path Constraint and hit OK. And what Path Constraint will do is it will constrain animation to happen along a given path. One of the things I could also do with this animation controller is select a Look At target. So if the camera's looking at something, where do I want to put the target? For example, if I clicked Pick Target, I would hit the teapot, and the target is locked to the pivot point of the teapot. I'm going to hit Control-Z to undo that. I think I liked it where it was better. As we go down a little bit further, we have the path parameters, and it says Add Path. We added a path constraint controller, so now it's saying, what path do you want to use? So let's hit Add Path, select our line here, and look at this. Automatically, under path options, percent along path is already animated. We're seeing these red brackets here. So as I make sure that we're at frame 0 and that the camera viewport is selected and active, let's hit the question mark to see what we just did. Hey, whoa. We automatically animated this camera to follow the position of this path. It even auto-animated for us. Now, we did a similar thing with trajectories earlier, but this is a little bit more powerful. This is what Path Constraint was really built for. And this is just one of many animation controllers inside 3ds Max. I recommend checking them out. There's some fun stuff there that can really make your job as an animator go much more smoothly. Before we get started talking about the dope sheet and animation curves, let's make a sphere in the top view. And then in the front view, let's go ahead and animate that crazily. I'm going to start over here, move along in time, move down, move along in time, move up, move along in time at the end, and finally let's go down. I just love how easy it is to animate in Max. That never gets old to me. I'm just going to hit the letter N to turn off auto key. And we're now ready to talk about the dope sheet. The dope sheet is an old world animation term. And the dope sheet, or exposure sheet, as it was often called, is actually a piece of paper that contained information for the animator, letting them know specific information about the way a scene should go. We get there by going to the Graph Editors menu, selecting Track View Dope Sheet. Let's expand this out a little bit. And boy, there's quite a bit here. And just like the dope sheets of old, this gives you everything you need to know about your scene. You could open up materials for your scene. You could open up environment information. Even video post stuff is here. If you wanted to add sound to your Max file, you could do that here. Now, if you're just going to add a soundtrack, I recommend doing that later. It's a little bit easier to do. But oftentimes in Max, if you're an animator, you're going to animate to audio. Maybe you're going to animate someone's mouth to speak the parts of a voiceover actor. So you're going to want that sound to be in Max. To get it there, right-click on the sound area, select Properties, and then just simply hit Choose Sound to browse on your computer for a sound file. I'm just going to hit Cancel there. Also, the dope sheet, we can view our keyframes. We're seeing these little notches here. We could click and move these around. And this is great because as our scene gets more and more complicated, we could sync up seemingly unrelated keys to other things that are happening in our scene. We could also go over to the ranges area. And this will control the endpoints and the outpoints of our objects. It's almost kind of like a little mini video editor or something. We could drag this to the left so it starts a little bit later. And you can see our keyframe scaling as we're moving this here. Do the same thing for the end frames as well. Oops, that was the timeline. There we go. Now the big thing here is under modes, we could switch from the dope sheet to the curve editor. Woohoo, that looks confusing, doesn't it? Folks, what you're actually seeing here is a visual representation of the velocity of our animation. When we're in beginning animation, we spend all our time down here. When we're in advanced animation, where all the big bucks and all the really powerful control is, happens right here with these curves. I'm going to focus on this red curve, and because it's red, I'm going to assume, and rightfully so, that it's on the X position. So click to highlight that. Now, we can look in the front view, hit home and hit the question mark to preview this. We can see our curve, and there goes our timeline scrolling through. Now, if we were to click on these curves and move them around, for example, let's just kind of do some crazy stuff here. Let me hit home and now hit the question mark and see if you notice a difference in our animation. It moves much quicker at certain parts. Again, we talked about this a little bit with tangents earlier, but here we don't just automatically click tangents. We can as a starting point, but we do them manually for the ultimate in control. I'm going to close the curve editor and be aware that here in the timeline, there's this mini curve editor button, and I could click that and have like a little tiny curve editor. But I never use this. When I work on animation curves, I like big curves, but that's just me. A lot of programs have tiny curve editors, so I probably suck or something. I'm going to close this out. And that's all we're going to touch on as far as animation curves and the dope sheet are concerned. But if you want to be a successful animator, you must learn to master those curves. That's where all the power is. When you bring something to life and it's lifelike, it's not because you have amazing modeling skills or you can make some dragon or some video game girl that's scantily clad. The power of being an animator happens in those curves. Master them and you will have a hard time not being unbelievably successful. Let's set up this scene here by creating a geosphere in the top view. Moving that over a little bit, and then selecting a light, creating a target spot in the front view. And let's arc rotate around in the perspective view, so we're seeing that specular highlight just a little bit. Very good. Now, in this segment, we're going to be talking about active shade. Active shade is a state of view in a viewport that will allow you to see instant rendered updates to materials and lighting changes. This is pretty exciting. Let's right-click on the name of the view here. And under the Views submenu, there's a bunch of angles we can look at. And then there's this weird freak, Active Shade. Select that. And you can see how quickly it goes and renders this. Now, this is a little bit of an exaggeration. Usually when you're using Active Shade, it takes a while to update when you're making big changes. All the same, it's pretty sweet to be able to have this little constantly rendered area as you're fiddling with materials and lighting. So for example, if I go in the top view, right-click, select the Move tool. Let's move this light around and watch my Active Shade view. As soon as I let go, it updates. Now let's select the geosphere. Let's apply a default gray material. And in a couple seconds, automatically updated. Tell you what, let's adjust that specularity. Bump that up. A couple seconds later, there it is, right there in the viewport. Let's go try to add a bump map here and see what it does. That little noise map here on the bump channel. Oh, automatically updates. See, folks, this is a great place to go when you're learning Max and you're first learning materials and maps and all that type of stuff. Take a viewport into Active Shade. It'll give you a great education on what you're doing as you adjust lights and materials. All right, some more extremely fun stuff here, folks. Let's make a sphere in the top view. And let's go over to the Modify tab. Let's go down to the modifier list. Boy, I wish there was more time to talk about this. This is going to be so fun. Let's select hair and fur. And instantly we have all this hair and or fur. Open this up. I'm going to select faces and hit Control A to select all. Let's hit this button, Style Hair. So instantly we have these little orange spikes, and we have this little cursor here. Now if you look, what's selected is this brush. So we have this digital hair, and we're going to grab it and just start combing. Just play with it. Be your own personal beautician here. Let's arc rotate around here. Kind of like a guy with the hairy beard or something. I don't know. Use the scissors here. Kind of chop a little bit here. Kind of give him a little trim. Very nice. Okay, let's select the perspective viewport. Hit F9 to render. And there you have it. Some really great looking hair. Except for the part where I accidentally buzzed him a little bit on the face there. But other than that, this is absolutely amazing looking hair. And not only that, it's one of those things that's just really fun to play with. I'm not much of a fashion guy in real life. No interest in cutting people's hair or things of that nature. But when it's digital, something about it is just so cool. So let's go ahead and close that window. Stop playing around. Let's go to File, Reset. No, yes. Let's create another sphere in the top view. And let's create a plane on top of that. We're going to deal with cloth a little bit. And actually, let's bump up the length segments and the width segments a little bit. So there's a little bit more geometry here to play with. And let's move this up in the front view so it's on top of our sphere here. And what we're going to do is set up a cloth simulation. Now, just like Reactor, the cloth modifier is a simulation. So let's go to the Modify tab. And now what we're going to do is drape this plane over this sphere, and we want this plane to be our cloth. So in order to really have this simulation work, we need to apply the cloth modifier to both objects. Now I'm going to add the cloth modifier to the plane and select Object Properties. Now nothing has been applied to the sphere yet, but that's okay. Once we go to the cloth rollout, we can hit Object Properties and add it here. So I'm going to select Add Objects. Going to get our hit list here. Let's just double click on sphere. And now it's part of our simulation. Now both of these objects by default are inactive. So what we need to do is tell Max the behavior of each object. The plane we want to be the cloth. Select that. Select the sphere. We don't want it to be inactive or cloth. We want it to be, as we go down here, the collision object. So let's go ahead and hit OK. And I'm going to maximize the perspective viewport here. Arc rotate around. Very nice. Now that we know what our players are in the game, Max is ready to simulate local. Hit that button. Hey, very nice. Very nice. You hit that button to turn off that simulation. Very cool. It's just that easy. It looks like cloth, but it's not. It's just a plane. So just a little bit about hair, fur, and cloth in Max. Boy, that's just fun stuff, isn't it? Now, I know I mentioned global illumination a little bit when we were talking about mental ray, but I just wanted to reiterate briefly how powerful this global illumination stuff really is, as well as all the other bells and whistles that come with mental ray to enhance your final render. I'm using a file here called Global Ill. You'll find it in the Chapter 15 folder. It's basically just 2 spheres and a little makeshift metal box. Render this out, renders in 2 seconds. It's really not that impressive. There's a couple lights here. There's a spotlight casting shadows, and just one more fill omni light taking up the scene. However, if I hit F10, change the renderer under the Common tab, assign renderer, hit this button, select Mental Ray Renderer, and then if we go up to Indirect Illumination, what I did is I selected Global Illumination, and for this I actually took the trace step down to 3. Quality is about the same, but it renders a little bit quicker. And I enabled Final Gather, used one of the 3ds Max 9 Mental Ray 3.5 presets, selected High, and then I rendered. And I'm not going to take the time to re-render that here, but I'm going to open up the Chapter 15 folder. Let's look at the default scanline render. That's what we just saw. Now again, in the Windows Picture and Facts view, I'm going to hit the right arrow on your keyboard to see what this render looks like using global illumination in Mental Ray. Wow, that's a really big difference. Now if you were to study each little piece of this, it doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. If you look, for example, at this wall on the left, it's darker and then it gets lighter, no big deal. But if you look closely, this is all one flat color. When we look at the global illumination render, we see edges of the shadow. It's not just flat and dull and lifeless. Even though the scene is not well lit. Actually, it is well lit, but it's not lit well, if you know what I'm talking about. I just tossed 2 lights in there. Didn't do a really good job of setting this up. But even still, we're getting a little bit more photorealism here. Notice the shadows in the plain old render. These spheres seem to just be hovering. But as we go to our global illumination render, we see some of this light bouncing off the bottom of our sphere as it would in real life. And there's just something about global illumination. Sometimes, like in this example, I can describe what it's doing. Other times, I can't describe it. It just looks realistic to me. And with Max, using the default scanline renderer, it's easy to make stuff that looks a little too flat, a little too fake and digital. But again, if we learn to master Mental Ray, there's some great power there to add amazing realism to our scenes. All right, folks, let's pay our final goodbyes here to Herbie the robot, who's been such a loyal friend and ally. You'll find him in the robot.max file in your Chapter 15 exercise files folder. Let's go to the Create tab, select Geometry, create a plane. Let's make this in the top view, about yay big. And let's move it over. And this is going to be a waving cape here. So right now it looks like a mere plane. Soon it will not be. Move that over maybe a little. There's Herbie's cape. Now to make it wave in the distance, we're going to add what's called a space warp. To get there, we go over to the space warps area, the only area we haven't talked about yet, and we're going to go to the geometric deformable dropdown. There's all sorts of stuff that you can do with these space warps though. For example, under forces, you could select wind and then link that to a snow particle system and have the wind blow the snow. I'm going to go back to the dropdown and select geometric deformable again, and let's add a wave space warp. In the top view, I'm going to make a wave space warp here. And we first click and drag to set the initial size. And then we let go. And then we drag our mouse to select the amplitude of the wave. And if you look at the bottom of the left view, you can pretty much see as I'm dragging here. That looks good. I'm going to click to hit OK there. Right click to get out of space warp creation mode. Hit W to move this puppy. And let's get this space warp about where Herbie's cape is. Looks about right. Now, in the left view, I'm going to zoom in using my middle wheel mouse. What we're going to do to make our plane follow the warping of this space warp that we've just added, we're going to use this tool, bind to space warp. So click that, click our plane, click and drag. Once you get this icon on the space warp, let go, and it flashes momentarily to let you know that it understands what you did. Just going to select a different tool here. I hate having wacky tools like that selected because then I forget that I have them selected and I try to do something and it never works. So anytime I do something like bind something to a space warp or link something, I always immediately go back to the select tool or one of the transforms, just so I always know where I'm at. But that's just me. Now let's select the camera view here. And let's actually select the space warp. Go to the Modify tab. I'm going to zoom out here so we can look at the left view a little bit better. I'm going to hit the letter N to turn on Auto Key. Hit End to go to the end of our animation. And let's go ahead and crank up phase, which will animate the phase of our wave space warp. Whoa. Okay, now, as I select the camera view, hit home, hit the question mark to preview. There we go. The Cape of Herbie in all of his triumphant glory. Oh, it's just beautiful. Seriously though, it's a really cool way to warp an object and control an object by a system rather than manually animating all of those vertices. Our final trick in the intermediate max sampler actually deals with the unwrap UVW modifier. Let's go ahead and create a box in the top view. Go over to the Modify tab. From the modifier list, go down to Unwrap UVW. And let's go ahead and go to the sub-object mode of Unwrap UVW. Select Face. Hit Control A to select all faces. And under the parameters here, hit Edit. And we'll see the familiar menu we've seen. Let's go to Mapping, Flatten Mapping, and hit OK. We have all the pieces of our box. Now, we went through all this before, but when we did so, we had a map. We knew going into this what we wanted our mesh to line up like because we already had the map created. Well, a lot of times, like when you're modeling a character, how do you know how to paint the mesh? How do you know how to paint a face if you don't know where the nose is? And so it's actually a very common workflow to go backwards from the way we did it, to actually start with the mesh and then take this mesh into Photoshop, for example, and then paint directly on the mesh. Now, in order to do that before, you had to use a third-party plugin called Textporter. You don't have to do that anymore. Just go to Tools, Render UVW Template, then hit Render UVW Template after you've set up the size and all that kind of stuff. And there you have it. Now, we're not seeing everything here because I wasn't zoomed in, but if you zoom into the render here, you'll see that the pieces are already cut out. So I could then go into Photoshop and paint on this map exactly where I wanted it to. I could paint on these edges here to make sure there weren't any seams. And you can imagine if we had a character here and we had our alien face or whatever, how much easier it would be to paint over that face than to try to create that map from scratch in Photoshop without any kind of guide whatsoever. So this Render UVW template feature is absolutely essential when you're creating really advanced textures in Max. Hoo-wee! That was amazing. Ladies and gentlemen, as we wrap up this training series, I got to thank you for joining me. It has been an amazing experience. We have covered so much, and the tools that we've gone over can really change your professional life. And as you move forward on your own, I want you to be aware that there is a very large 3D community out there. And this great collection of artists and nerds in the 3D community is more generous than any other community on the internet that I've ever seen. People are always willing to give a helping hand. They offer free tutorials, lessons, instruction, as well as models, materials, and anything else you can think of. And so again, on behalf of Lynda.com, I'm Chad Perkins. I thank you for joining me, and happy modeling.